Saturday evenings on LBC. But when I'm not doing that, I go into schools and colleges all over the country and I deliver talks and conduct research with young people on issues related to mental health. I'm also the founder of a campaign called the Mental Health Media Charter, where we scrutinize the way that mental health is reported in media. So journalists in the room, beware. Before we get started with today's event, I just want to begin by acknowledging the incredibly serious and sad situation that is unfolding in Nepal. Anybody who is affected by that, who have loved ones or family that are missing, our hearts very much go out to you. A big thank you to Rethink Mental Illness for hosting this event today. We will hear from its Chief Executive, Mark Winstanley, in just a minute. And also a big thank you to Mind, the Associate Director of Mind, Minesh Patel, is also with us here this morning. And to Safely Held Spaces, they've both been instrumental in organising today's event. As well as the people in the room today, we have over 2,000 people who registered to join us online, which is wonderful, to hear more about the results of the ODDESSI trial. I'm sure many of you have already seen that that's been covered on both the BBC and Sky News this morning. In just a moment, we're going to hear from people who have been at the heart of the ODDESSI trial over the past 10 years. That includes our keynote speaker, ODDESSI's chief investigator, Professor Steve Pilling, who's going to join us on the screen from France. Also here is affected by anything that we discuss today, and you need to take 5. We do have a mental health first aid person here called Kathy Thorley. If you need a quiet space, just let any member of the production team know and we'll be able to provide that for you. Open dialogue was an approach to mental health care which was first developed in Finland in the 1980s. Now, at the time, Finland had some of the worst mental health outcomes in the world. And the Finns rebuilt their entire mental health system from the ground up. They reimagined mental health services where the patient was put at the heart of the experience. Crucially, in Finland had some of the worst mental health outcomes to dramatically reduce the need for traditional psychiatric hospital beds by treating patients in their homes and in the community within 24 hours of them reaching crisis. You may know, you probably do know, that Yvette Cooper has announced earlier this month that 100 new mental health hubs are going to be open throughout the country. That tells us where mental health care might happen. Today, looking at the ODDESSI trial, we're going to ask how that care might happen. And we'll be hearing today how open dialogue is not just a therapeutic approach, but it's also an operating principle. It's a way of organising mental health services in the UK differently. For many people who work in the mental health field, today is a day that they have been waiting for more than a decade. And we know the importance of and the excitement around it. We have 2,000 people, as I've already mentioned, who will be joining us online. That's from 15 different countries all over the world. We're also joined live from the International Open Dialogue Conference, which is taking place simultaneously in Iceland. We're very grateful to the organisers. They changed the format of their conference. It's taking place just outside Reykjavik today, so that they could tune into this broadcast live and hear the results. All of which makes this a truly historic event and a landmark in the history of mental health care. And I'm hoping that all of you will leave today having 2 questions answered, at least, hopefully more, but at least 2 questions answered. The first of which is, what is open dialogue? And the second is, if we introduced it into UK mental health care, what would that look like? How would it change the way that we administer healthcare here in the UK? So as I've said, we're especially grateful to our hosts Rethink and Mind today, and we want to open the event with a few words from their leadership. So please welcome to the stage Mark Winstanley, CEO of Rethink, and Minesh Patel, Associate Director of Mind.
Thank you for that. And Good morning to everybody. It's an honour to welcome you to this launch from Rethink Mental Illness's headquarters here in London, for those of you who are joining online. Open dialogue is so close to the philosophy of our founders 60 years ago, who were family and friends of people with severe mental illness. And that 60 years ago, the idea of a patient being treated as an equal would have been a totally alien concept to them. Unimaginable, I would have imagined. The philosophy remains true today, and that's actually reflected in Rethink's current strategy, which recognises the role of the family, social networks, and good clinicians in improving outcomes and delivering a more fulfilling life for people. To see these principles positively reflected in the ODDESSI results that we're going to hear about today is hugely heartening. These are significant finds with the potential to have a transformative effect across health, social care, and hopefully wider society. Hopefully this will also provide an inspiration for those who are currently creating the new mental health strategy and the modern service framework for severe mental illness, all of which are due later in the year. So I look forward to seeing where this work leads in a system that I think we all acknowledge needs reform. And to quote Norman Lamb's book title, to be more human. That's for patients, families, friends, and clinicians. So we look forward to creating a system which always helps and never hinders. So most welcome today.
Hi everyone, really good to be here, and Mind is really pleased to be supporting the work of Open Dialogue, and I echo everything that Mark has said. And I think it's important to recognise the context of this conversation, a context where we're seeing increasing demand for mental health services, growing numbers on waiting lists, and also mental health professionals who don't often feel they're able to deliver the care they want to. We launched some new research this week actually at Mind, where we surveyed almost 800 NHS mental health professionals, and a third of them said they don't feel they're able to consistently deliver the care that patients need. We need to rethink our mental health system. That's our view at Mind, and we've been calling for what we call a model of same-day open access, so that when somebody reaches out for help, they can have that initial conversation about their support needs. What that looks like in terms of support will be different for different people, but we're really clear that services and support like Open Dialogue need to be part of that ecosystem of support, recognising that good relational holistic care delivers better outcomes for people. It reduces pressure on services, as we'll hear more about later on in the results. I'll leave it there. There's lots more to come in terms of speakers, but we're really proud to be supporting this event and this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you both. It's lovely to see two titans of the mental health space. Can I say friendly rivals? Sometimes as well, joining forces in the way that you have. Now, for many of you who are here today, our next guest will need no introduction. I was actually working with government on mental health policy back in 2015. I was very briefly the government's first ever mental health champion for schools, and they fired me for being too outspoken about austerity and Michael Gove. Mental health was something of a trending topic at the time in media, and there are a lot of politicians that seem to be scrambling around to have something relevant to say on the issue. And not all of them seemed like they were truly invested or really cared about the issues. But there was one politician who was so obviously, authentically passionate about it. There are a lot of politicians that to improve mental health services and outcomes truly went above and beyond to try and bring that about. And I'm of course talking about our next speaker, who is former health minister and current legend, Sir Norman Lamb. Today, Norman has launched his new book, which is called Be More Human: Why Mental Health Care is Broken and What We Can Do to Fix It. The Times newspaper, whose reporter Roisin Kelly travelled to Finland earlier this year and produced a great podcast actually on the history of open dialogue, published an interview with Norman this week, and you can see it hopefully on the screen. And the headline is, "This is the generation that could revolutionize mental health." So it's my great pleasure to welcome Norman Lamb.
Thanks very much. And this is it. So, you know, you can see it in the real thing. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for those kind words, Natasha. Very generous of you. And I've been waiting for this moment for a long time, but I know Russell has had that feeling probably very intensively. But in 2014, when I was in the Department of Health, this bloke came to see me. The team had fixed up this appointment because I was told he had something interesting to say about a different approach to mental health. And that bloke was Russell Razak. And he told me all about this really fascinating approach pioneered in the north of Finland, as you describe, Natasha, and how with some of the most unwell people, people with psychosis, the outcomes could be remarkable and critically so much better than we experience in this country. And I pay enormous tribute to Russell, because it takes something, doesn't it, to pursue a cause from 12 years ago, and he was already onto it before he saw me, to finally get to this point where we have the outcome of this biggest ever trial of its kind. And I know some of the results. I'm excited to hear the full details this morning, but the results are remarkable, and it tells us something about what we're doing wrong at the moment, and I think perhaps really excitingly, how we could transform lives and make things so much better for people by adopting the principles that Russell will be describing to us, along with others, this morning. I am passionate about this subject. Natasha sort of described our initial encounters back in 2015 and the struggles with Michael Gove and so forth. But there is a very personal aspect to this for me, but I'm sure for all of us, you know, because it touches every family in some way or another. But my older sister, Catherine, in her mid-60s, following the death of our mother, fell into deep clinical depression and went into an inpatient unit as a voluntary patient, but was locked up like everyone else, in a fairly dismal unit, along with perhaps 18 other people, all of whom were very unwell, with very little access to the outside world. How do we do this to people? And expect them to recover? I mean, recovery is despite what we do to people, not because of. Some months after her discharge, after 10 weeks in this place, she took her own life. Now, our family has had to cope with that tragic loss, but there are so many families in our country who experience loss through suicide. And we all know in this room, and for people watching, that we can do so much better. The system is broken. It fails people routinely across the country, despite, and it's really important to say this, very dedicated people working in mental health. But they are doing their very best despite the system, not because of it. Being placed on a waiting list for months on end when you're desperate is not acceptable. And in a way, it was brought home very strongly to me, again in our own family, when our oldest son was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder as a teenager. We were told we'd have to wait 6 months at a time when we were desperate. So what did we do? Well, we paid for treatment because we were able to, but most people can't. So that is an injustice. And you cannot have an effective mental health system that involves people waiting interminably for something to happen. It makes everything worse. And for young people, it puts your education on hold as well as your health. Now, open dialogue. which centrally involves looking at and working with the person, addressing the issues that are important to them, recognizing that none of us are an island in isolation, that we are all about our relationships with our family and friends, working together with that wider group, understanding and finding out what the original causes of the distress may be, and then finding routes to recovery. This very personal, relationship-based approach, kinder approach, respectful approach, is what we need to introduce in our system. I'm also, it has to be said, a massive fan of the 24/7 community mental health centres that you mentioned. The government has announced capital funding for 100 extra. We had one at the Maudsley when I was chair there. It is developing its approach along with all the other centres around the country. And they are demonstrating already reduced crises, reduced attendances at A&E, reduced hospital admissions. If you combine the approach of open dialogue with the setting of a centre with no waiting lists, open access, continuity of people, that you see the same friendly faces each time you go in, you're not discharged, you come back when you need to, you don't need a referral, you just walk in and seek help. We could, as that Times article suggested, revolutionise our approach to mental health. That is the opportunity in front of us now. And I'm just desperate to ensure that we grasp that opportunity. There are risks, always risks, that the system could lurch in the other direction towards more coercion, more control. But if we look at the evidence and if we apply the evidence, we could do something really exciting for people, which could massively enhance people's lives and give happiness and joy to families across our country. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Norman. Our next speaker was elected President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in April. He's taken time out from his very busy schedule this morning here for the announcement of the ODDESSI results. Please welcome to the stage Professor Subodh Dave.
I think I might need some help with the mic. Thank you, Natasha. Oh, thank you. Just about audible here. I think I can fix my mic here properly. Oops, sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Natasha. Well, congratulations, Russell, Steve, wherever you're watching, and great to have lovely colleagues from the other mental health sector here. I have been following the ODDESSI trial for quite some time. I think personally I have a significant interest in lived experience. I feel that delivering good care, clinicians know this, patients know this, carers know this, is really about operationalizing evidence-based practice. How do you kind of translate that? And then you can't do that without involving patients and carers. You can't really do that unless you personalize what is essentially population-generated evidence to the individual in front of you. So that is kind of intuitive knowledge that we have, and yet I think generating evidence for that intuitive process has been difficult. I think we've seen that open dialogue has been in operation for quite some time, but it hadn't really been studied in the way that you have, which is in a randomized controlled trial format, which I think generates that highest quality evidence. So I think I'm particularly pleased as the President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists to see that we are generating high quality evidence, because for me, I think mental health, I mean, you know, you often get this, well, like you, I think, Natasha, you champion the cause of mental health, but the reality is all of us here in the room, we know that the marginalization of mental health and psychiatry is real. I think there's no question about that. The underfunding of clinical services, the underfunding of research, all of that ultimately has an impact on our patient outcomes. And I think, for me, I think it's been really particularly welcome to see that we are able to generate that high quality evidence, and which I hope will generate more interest in funding this kind of high quality research, because now what we want to see is how does this work when we take this away from the few centers in London to other parts of the country. How does it translate when people like Russell, who have felt very passionate about open dialogue, are not leading it, but someone else is leading it, someone whom the initial cohort have trained. And I think that will be exciting, but will also be a learning opportunity for us to learn things. And I hope that, like you outlined, Natasha, this is not just an intervention. It's not like a medication. It's a process. It's a way of weaving in relational care, which we know is very important, into the very fabric of how we deliver care to our patients. So I think that is what makes it particularly interesting. From the college's perspective, this is something which is very much, relational care is very much at the heart of our curriculum. We set standards for high quality care for our patients. We set standards for in supporting our psychiatrists and delivering high quality care for our patients. And our curricula very much reflect the requirement. As I was dean before I became president, and as dean, we really shone a spotlight on formulation skills and how we see individuals as individuals, not as a collection of symptoms, how we see them as, in the context of their biology, in the context of their psychological world, in the context of their social world. And I feel that approaches like open dialogue kind of bring that biopsychosocial to life. They incorporate that into everyday practice. And surely that is a very, very welcome move for all of us in the mental health sector, whether we are patients, whether we are carers, policymakers, or psychiatrists like me. So I wish the project very well. I hope that what this study and this publication today and the launch and the publicity that will be generated for this will lead to more investment in psychiatry and in mental health research, more investment in disseminating and operationalizing that research, so that we know that there is evidence already available. And in many ways, if we just funded the implementation of that research, we'd be doing so much better for our patients. So I think there's almost a 15 to 17-year gap. And I think we really need to start narrowing that gap for our patients. It's just unconscionable that our patients have to wait that long for what is already available. So I hope that this will generate and spur that funding and that drive towards implementing and starting to make a difference for our patients now, not sometime in the future. So wish you well, and the college is always very supportive and works collaboratively with all our colleagues to deliver these outcomes for our patients and carers. So I think that's my commitment to all of you here. Thank you.
Liked what you said there, Subodh, about a person, not just a collection of symptoms. I think that's really at the heart of everything that we're going to be talking about today. And in a moment, we're going to be hearing from our keynote speaker, who is Professor Steve Pilling, is going to more than 500 patients who took part in the ODDESSI trial. So before we hear about those numbers and statistics, let's first hear a real story, what it's actually like to go through the process of open dialogue. Joining me now on stage is Rachel Bannister, whose family received open dialogue and who's the founder of the campaign group Mental Health Time for Action. Rachel. Hello.
Hi, Natasha.
Nice to see you face to face.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
We spoke to each other on the phone on Wednesday, and you were telling me a little bit about your family and the experiences that you've had. First of all, tell us what it was like to have what we might call more traditional patient care.
So if I talk a bit about how our journey began, really, it was a little over a decade ago when my eldest daughter started to show signs of mental distress. She had eating issues, very low mood. And up to that point, we'd had this beautiful continuity of care with our long-standing GP. He'd seen me through all my pregnancies. It was, relational care in the community, as it should be. So we were quickly referred to secondary services, and I naively thought, it will be very similar. There'll be continuity. We'll have the opportunity to build up a relationship. And looking back, I just think how naive that was. We were thrown into what I would describe as a very brutal system. You know, there was lack of staff, very stressed staff, not the resources that we needed. I'd imagine this mental health toolbox with all these amazing different modalities in that we've since discovered, EMDR, trauma therapy, art therapy, and there was none of that really. I would like to emphasise though that there were some really amazing, compassionate, experienced staff that really wanted to do their best for us, but there were so many other young people in need of help. There were staff who were clearly very stressed, taking early retirement. So we had 2 years really of this inconsistent lack of continuity, in which time our daughter deteriorated. And then sadly, she needed an acute placement, and that was 50 miles from home. Of having to leave your very sick daughter with a team of individuals that you've never met before. You know, I felt like my heart had been ripped from my body. And I often think of the quote by Rome Return, all separation causes a wound, a rupture of the mind. And at that moment, that was the beginning of my deterioration mentally as well. And then I ended up needing acute care. So this sort of continued, and then it was 100 miles away from home, and that hospital didn't feel safe. My daughter was very institutional. In an admission 300 miles from our home. And I remember being at the airport, East Midlands Airport, waiting to board this plane, and she was so sick. She was lying on the floor, and the plane staff was saying, you know, is she well enough? You know, can we let her on the plane? And again, handing her over to a new team, and I have great warmth for Scottish people. They were just so lovely up there, you know. They hugged me, they held me, and they did all they could. But then the staff in there was cut, and her deterioration began again. And it was at that point where I just thought, this can't carry on. I remember saying goodbye to her one occasion and just being heartbroken, and then thinking, going back to my other 2 daughters, and I just thought, I can't carry on. I wanted it all to end. And I remember being in the taxi and just wishing that the taxi would crash and I wouldn't have to go through this anymore. And so we got her home after a fight, and then I started to set up a campaign group, really. We set up this campaign group basically because we were lucky. You know, we had I was able, we had the financial support so I could stay, give up my teaching job and be at home. But I met so many other people on the way that weren't fortunate enough to have that. So I set up this campaign group, and I started doing some lived experience work for the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and it was there that I met Russell. And I always remember this Zoom call we had, and I was telling him about the trauma that we'd been through and this lack of continuity, no holistic approaches. And he started to talk about open dialogue, which I'd heard about. And then it just sort of sank in that there is a way of working, of being with people that doesn't require, you know, the suffering and the revolving door of inpatient care. So that was a significant turning point for me. And then eventually I actually left my teaching job and started to do the training myself. And then a couple of years ago, after quite a fight and, you know, lots of negotiating, we managed to get my daughter referred to an open dialogue service. And
it strikes me from what you're saying, it's the care you originally had is almost like a textbook getting everything wrong.
Absolutely.
And how to make everything worse. And yet your expectations weren't unreasonable at all. What you're describing, I think anybody who hasn't tried to navigate the system would probably expect that.
We all want the same. We all want to be able to build up that trusting relationship. And when that's enabled, that's when you can start to tell your story and to feel safe. And I strongly believe that that healing is the first step. Being heard is the first step to healing. If you don't feel heard and you don't feel safe, you know, that mental health recovery journey, you don't stand a chance. So I remember my eldest daughter, she had her assessment for open dialogue, and she knew a lot about it, I guess, because I'd been talking about it a fair amount, and she'd seen all the papers lying around the house. And I remember coming out of the assessment, and she had this sparkle in her eyes, and she said, "Mum, they talked about me in front of me." And I was like, she says, "That's never happened before."
Yeah, and
And
that
then-
meant something to her.
Yeah, because we'd been in a situation, and this was in Scotland, where the professionals had got together and we were stood outside and we could hear them talking about us and making decisions about us and actually saying things that were factually incorrect. And that feeling, you know, I still feel that pain and that anger, really, that was happening. You were talking about us, and then we were going in and you're presenting it with affect complete. Here's your plan. This is what we're doing. And this was completely different. And then a few weeks into her open dialogue treatment, I said to her, we sat down. I remember where we were sitting in this coffee shop, and it was prior to me doing some filming with North East London Foundation Trust. And I said, "Oh, tell me, you know, what does it mean to you?" And she took my phone and she wrote down, and she said, "Mum, it's the first time I felt listened to in the whole time I've been in mental health services."
Wow.
And that was a profoundly sobering moment for me, to think that she'd been in this system for 10 years, but only now she felt listened to. And then secondly, she said, "It's the first time I don't carry the fear of abandonment if I don't get well within a set period of time." So she finally had that support around her that's long term. And that was, you know, that's been the most amazing thing in her healing journey. And I think we talked a bit a couple of days ago about what it's been like for me.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because it's a part of the story that's very often missed, is the impact on the person around the person that's receiving treatment. If you don't mind sharing a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think that the thing that really struck me one day, and we were talking about some really difficult stuff, and again, it takes a while for that difficult stuff to come up. We had many sessions where my daughter just talked about her music taste, or you know, her fashion taste, and you know, somebody coming in would be thinking, "Gosh, what on earth's going on here?" But you know, that's how you build up the relationship and the trust and the understanding. And then, you know, there was a day when we were talking about some really difficult stuff, really painful stuff. She was talking about things she'd never told me before, and I was really tearful, really emotional. And I remember feeling sort of quite tense, because I'd been emotional in situations before in treatment as usual, and it was shut down. You know, in a very kind, gentle way. You know, "Come on, Mum, let's go make you a cup of tea."
Right.
We can't have you being emotional in front of your daughter. But this was such a different experience, and I sat there and I cried. And then there was just this silence, this, you know, beautiful silence, where that sadness and that pain was held. And that was a really important moment for me. And since that time, we've both cried together. Other family members have come in, and it's been the same. We've got angry. You know, we've shown our frustration. And I feel having that space just to be yourself and having that emotion held, it's, you know, and until you've experienced that, it's really hard to explain, you know, the significance, the importance of that. And I have this image in my head now when I think about open dialogue, of these huge hands around our family. And when things come up, difficult things come up in the family, instead of thinking, "I've got to hold this myself, I've got to sort this out," we'll say, "Oh, let's take that to open dialogue."
And I found that particularly interesting when we were speaking on the phone, because the received wisdom is that you can't show how you feel,
Yes.
because that will make whoever is at the centre worse.
Yes, yeah.
And yet you being allowed to express how you felt was a
Yeah.
really important part of your healing journey.
But
wasn't it?
in addition to that, the practitioners then turning to each other and reflecting about how they feel.
Yeah.
And for them saying how it felt to them when they saw me cry. You know, that's also, you know, incredibly important. I think there's another thing I would like to mention too, because I think the whole time in treatment as usual, a lot of the time I did feel very criticised and pathologised, and, "Oh, well, Mum's depressed," or "Mum's had this." But we've never had anything positive said about us. And we sat in this open dialogue meeting, and it was online, and I'd got both of my other daughters with me. And the practitioners turned to reflect, as is what happens in open dialogue, and they commented on the love and the warmth between us as a family. And again, I cried, because nobody had ever picked up on that the whole time we were in services. And there is great love and warmth between us, and there always has been. But to have somebody, you know, say that to reflect, you know,
Yeah.
the other practitioner was a really profound and important
That's
moment. And it's
wonderful.
strengthened us as a family, I think. And I think the relationships between us all, my eldest daughter, my youngest daughter, their relationship shifted quite a lot. She was quite young when my eldest daughter was ill, and I think, you know, that's just been so important. And I feel incredibly lucky, really, that we've finally been able to access this.
And that's what I was going to ask you. So where are you now, having had access to open dialogue? What kind of pathway are you on now?
Well, I think the most amazing thing is my daughter hasn't been readmitted to hospital, and I can't imagine that happening, really. My younger daughter and my middle daughter have witnessed the power and have been part of that, and are now accessing open dialogue themselves. I mean, my younger daughter featured in the Financial Times in January, so she started open dialogue about 18 months ago, and within 6 months, she suddenly decided she was going to university. And this is a young person who had been out of school, been signed off work because she was so anxious. And then she had this space. And I love the Maya Angelou quote, because I think that sums up really why it worked for her. There's no greater agony than carrying the burden of an untold story. And my little girl, who was so young when my eldest daughter was ill, carried the burden of that untold story for all these years. And it was described as anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
And actually it was because she didn't have anywhere to sort of offload that. And again, she's talked about things in that dialogical space that I didn't know about. I didn't know she saw that she heard that. And I think in just that 6 months, so much healing and processing has taken place. She blew our mind in August last year, and she said, right, I've gone through clearing and I'm going to university 100 miles away. And we were like, okay, this doesn't sound possible.
Yeah.
But, you know, she did it, but she's had open dialogue weekly throughout that time, and it has been really difficult for her. It's not been easy, but you can see, you know, the power of open dialogue.
And is it your eldest daughter? Because I read the Financial Times piece, and it actually opens by saying at one point she was unable to work and was having to rely
So
on
that
the
was
welfare
my
state.
younger daughter who was, you know, having universal credit. She did have a job, but then, you know, her anxiety and her low mood sort of prevented her from continuing with that. So it was really quite a dramatic turnaround. She'd been out of school since COVID, and had done her A-levels online. She'd managed to do that, but incredibly isolating, you know.
Of course, yeah.
Trying to educate yourself in that way. So, yeah, really, still quite shocked by it, really, that happened. I think the other really important thing that I want to get across to people also is the peer aspect of open dialogue. And I think it's been having peer workers trained as part of our network that's been really key. I think the wisdom of having experienced it, you know, mental health and services yourself, is extremely helpful when you're sort of the person at the centre of concern, the patient, and you can see the connection that my daughters make with the young person. You know, you've been there and been through it yourself, and it's I think that's a really fundamentally important part of it, really.
It means a lot to young people in my experience if you say, I genuinely know how you feel, because I've been there. Thank you so much. If there is anybody watching this who is currently navigating the system as you experienced it to begin with, what would you say to them to give them hope?
Well, I think here we have the results, don't we? As you said, we've got the how. So I'm hoping that the government will take this on board. I'm very happy to meet with the Health Secretary, Yvette Cooper, and talk about our experiences, and my daughter's happy to come along. I would advise them to find somewhere that will offer peer-supported open dialogue. And I realise it's not going to be rolled out that quickly, but we have the how, and there's absolutely, we've got the evidence. So we have to do this. If we want change, it's now. And I think where there's a will, there's a way. But we need the support of decision makers, the government. We need everybody on board.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rachel. Really appreciate you sharing your story. Thank you. How incredible to hear from Rachel. I always think that it's stories like that really bring all of this to life. Our next speaker is a consultant psychiatrist and open dialogue trainer. He's lived and breathed open dialogue for over 15 years now. He came up with the idea for this ODDESSI trial 13 years ago, went to meet Professor Pilling at UCL with the hope of bringing him in, and the rest, as they say, is history. He was recently appointed the very first professor of relational psychiatry in the UK and works as both a clinician in London and an academic at SOAS. It is therefore with great pleasure that I welcome today the man who got the whole ball rolling and has been with it ever since, Professor Russell Razak.
Thank you. As you probably noticed, we're slightly rejigging the order here because it's not easy to get Steve in deepest France. So at some point, hopefully he comes back online into the real world and we'll be able to hear from him. So I think what I'll do is I'll break my talk into two parts. So one part pre-Steve and one part post-Steve, because he really should be the one who tells you the results first. So it really shouldn't come from me. So I'll talk a little bit about the first thing I was going to talk about, which is what open dialogue actually is. So yeah, I encountered open dialogue many years ago, which was at a national conference on psychosis. And it was people with lived experience in the audience who started to ask the people on stage. And this was nearly 20 years ago. And they were saying, what about open dialogue? Why aren't we doing that? Why isn't that on your agenda? And I remember thinking, what is that? I've never heard of that. And as a psychiatrist, how come I don't know about something that other people are talking about? So it really should be my responsibility to go and find out what this thing is. So I went to workshops and I started reading books. And I had been in this sort of state of dissonance for some years because I knew that there's a strong evidence base that therapeutic relationships make us a big difference to long-term outcomes. The bond that you form with patients, the way that you talk, the language you use has a big impact on long-term outcomes. And yet, that isn't really how our system is designed. So it was very frustrating to know this and yet not see it implemented. Then when I found out about open dialogue and looked it up, I'm like, that's how you do it. That's what these guys basically did. And what they did is three things, which is very different. There's lots of ways of describing open dialogue, and the minimum training is a year, so I'm not going to put you through a year of training right now. But just to put it in very simple terms, three things that are very different about open dialogue to standard treatment. The first thing is that we don't really see mental health difficulties as existing in somebody's head. It's not something that's just inside your brain. It exists between people as well. It exists within relationships, within the connections that people have. And so that's how it comes about. That's the only way that you can find your way out as well, through those relationships. And that involves the relationships with the people around you and the relationships you have with the service that work with you too. That should be what's at the center of care. So the first thing we do in open dialogue is we ask people strenuously, who else is important to you? Who else is going to help you, support you in this time in your life? And if there are people out there who can do that, then bring them in. And we want to be thinking about those relationships, connecting with those people and understanding the history and the story. Often in open dialogue, very commonly, anyone who's practiced it will tell you this, within a couple of sessions, they will tend to ask a question, which is, shall we talk about it? And the it is usually something that's happened in their lives before this happened. So they have got themselves to a position where they've understood, they've started to build their story and understand what brought them here today. Now, of course, you can still do open dialogue if they don't have people around, all right? If they want to just be seen on their own, that's fine too. But then we'll bring other people in virtually. So we'll ask, what would your father say if he was here? What would your sister be saying right now today? And that way they're still thinking about those relationships and those connections and how that got them here and how that can get them out as well. The second big difference is the way we relate to people. Now, traditionally, there's a top-down methodology involved in medicine, which is, I know the answers, I'll tell you what's wrong, and I'll give you the solutions. That doesn't really work in mental health a lot of the time, because what it effectively does is it disempowers people and makes them think that the only way I'm going to get better is through you. So every time I get unwell, I have to come back to you, and you have to tell me what to do and what's wrong. Open dialogue is very different to that. The emphasis for clinicians is on how do we make sure this person feels heard? How do we make sure these people here feel safe enough to start telling their own story and building their own narrative, so that they're not relying on you to tell them what's going on, but they are the ones who are actually deciding and working out what's happening for them. And then they start to develop something really key, it's fundamental here, which is a sense of agency. You know what? The answers are in me. We know what's really happening here, and we know how to get out of it. And if we don't allow them to unlock that space and that understanding early on, then they're basically going to be paralyzed because they think the answer's with you. I'm not them. So creating that space is really hard to do in a sort of clinical environment for most of your life in which you've been told, well, you're the one who has the answers. Sometimes, remember in medical school being taught, sometimes better to be wrong than to be uncertain. You know? It's very different in open dialogue. We are open to being uncertain. You know, that actually, you know what, we'll sometimes say, you know, to patients, I'll sometimes say myself, I haven't heard voices, I haven't heard these experiences that you're talking about. So in many respects, you are the expert here on what's going on. So let's hear from you. And then you give them that space, and they pause for a minute often, thinking, oh, okay, and they start to talk. And then it starts to come out. It's the difference between putting a sticking plaster over a wound and actually opening it up for it to be cleaned first, before you do that. Because if you only put the sticking plaster over a wound, what's going to happen is that they're going to keep coming back. And unfortunately, for far too many people, that is what happens. They keep coming back. That is the one thing we wanted to demonstrate we could change with open dialogue. This revolving door cycle that people are in again and again, coming in and out of hospital repeatedly, you know, and their quality of life so destroyed by that. You can't do things. You can't. So many people can't go to university. You can't hold down a job. You can't sustain a long-term research because you're cycling in and out of hospital. That's the thing we really wanted to stop. So that relationship, the way we talk, is fundamental. Giving that space where people feel able to tell their own story, trusting and safe enough to say the things that they couldn't otherwise have said. And we're not trying to create consensus. We're not all trying to agree with each other. We're just trying to hear all the different voices in the room, which does require quite a bit of work. One of the first times I went to meet Steve, I remember this, it was actually my first meeting with him in the office. And it was a bit of anecdote. Those of you who've watched Dragon's Den might be familiar with how this sometimes happens. You have an entrepreneur who's pitching to these big, high and mighty investors who've got all the money. And the only purpose of my meeting with Steve was just to say to him, one day I'll come back to you with evidence base, Steve. He's head of NICE. So I thought, one day I'll come back with an evidence base, and I hope you can put it in there and recommend it to policymakers. Halfway through the conversation, he starts pitching to me. Actually, this sounds really interesting. I've got a whole team. We can work on this together. I'm like, okay, that sounds good. The thing that he said is that when he did the research for home treatment teams, the idea was that when you send people into people's homes for the first time, remember, before home treatment teams existed, no mental health professional had ever set foot in someone's house, right? So he did the research that got people to get into people's homes. And he said, what we thought would happen is that they'll start to work with people's families. They'll start to engage with their wider network. That didn't happen, though. It just becomes a quick in and out. Are you all right? What's the risks? Give them meds and get out again. Why did that happen? He asked me. I said, well, because you never trained them to take the path, the opposite path to the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is a quick exchange and out again, right? But a more difficult path is to say, invite other people in and let's hear all the voices. And that isn't easy to do, right? It's going to be difficult, it'll be emotive, it'll be distressing. But opening yourself up to that, to allow that conversation to happen, can do profound things and make profound changes, you know? So that's the key difference, just the way that we have the dialogue, the way that we have that connection. Now, the third thing is, and this is the very big thing for managers in the system, the operational heavy lifting, to make sure that that relationship that you form in open dialogue stays throughout the whole care pathway. So you're not doing what we do at the moment, unfortunately. When you go into crisis, you go into a whole new team who have not met you before. And when you're in the crisis team, you're seeing different people every day, often new people every day who you've never met before. And they don't know your story, they haven't heard you and sat through all of that. And so all they can do is just a very quick, cursory, superficial check, but they don't really know you. So in open dialogue, what we say is that network that you formed, that sacred connection that you formed with each other at your moment of crisis, you are going to stay together for the whole time you're in the service. In fact, for the rest of your life. Because once you're discharged and out again, if you have anything that is distressing to you, if the dog dies, someone leaves home, it's difficult, come and see us, and the same people will see you to reconvene the same meeting. You're not going to have to go through the GP surgery or through this team and this team. Come straight to us, call it an open door discharge, and we will see you again. And that will make all the difference to, hopefully, your ability to remain connected with us the whole time. So, even if you're going into hospital, even if you're in crisis, it's the same team that's going to see you the whole time. So that makes the fundamental difference. And just checking, is there any? Have you connected with Steve yet? Do we know? No? Have we connected with Steve yet? Do we know? No? Okay. All right. As soon as you do, let me know. But I'll ramble on a bit longer. So, so essentially, we've trained about 1,000 members of staff across the system in the last 10 years since we started doing the training, and everybody finds that they have to take a leap of faith at the beginning. It's really interesting because we're used to a checkbox system of delivering care where you've got a whole lot of things that you need to check off and then put in the notes. And then that governs the way you speak. So you start to ask a series of questions and riddle folks with a series of questions. And they know that, well, you're here to populate some sort of table that you want to get all the information on. And we tell people that if you just allow them to talk and do certain things that we teach you to make sure they're going to talk more, you'll find out everything you needed to find and a lot more besides. And actually, you'll find as a result that you feel a lot safer, that the risk is managed a lot better because you've actually given them that space. And we often have to ask people, take that leap of faith the first time. Just try it once or twice, where you just do the kind of things we're telling you, you reflect with each other, you ask people to say more, simply sort of stepping back but giving the space, encouraging more dialogue. And what you'll find is that everything that you needed to put on your forms, you will actually have. There is a space in open dialogue at the very end when you can ask direct questions. And most of the time, in the last 12, 15 years, I've very rarely ever had to use it. Very rarely. If there's something that is really not actually addressed at all and you know it's important, you can come back to it. But usually, you allow the dialogue to flow and everything you could possibly have imagined asking has been answered. And time again, Kathy's here, Valti, we have trainers here who've been with me on this journey for 10 years. We hear people come back to us again and again. It's amazing. The thing that I was about to say or the thing that I was about to ask, I didn't. And then they came up with it themselves. And particularly if it's like ideas or suggestions of what to do next. We sit with that and then we allow the people to keep talking and then they come up with it, which is far more powerful than us coming up with it for them. So that's the fundamental, it's a cultural difference in open dialogue. We decided to go ahead and implement this in a range of trusts across the country. There was 6 different teams that we managed to recruit to do this trial. There was many more who were interested, but we wanted to pick a nice spread of demographics between very inner city, like Camden, Islington, Haringey, Waltham Forest, and outer London like Havering, then sort of semi-rural like Kent, and then Devon as well. So we had a nice spread of populations with different demographics that we were able to bring on board. And it was fascinating how we saw that sort of go down in very different populations, diverse populations, in order to have the service. Lots of work went on from so many people behind the scenes. You obviously had all the clinical teams who did the training and did the work, and then you had the service managers and the operational leads who enabled it to come about. So that is the background in terms of how ODDESSI came about, what open dialogue really is. We're going to move forward now to hear some more voices and then hopefully eventually the results. But thanks for staying with us so far.
Thank you. We're now going to have a completely impromptu section. As I'm sure you know, the NHS is extremely busy, so we're having some trouble getting hold of Professor Pulling. But I am going to invite Russell back up on the stage. Sorry, Russell. Please have a seat. And Professor Lynn Gabriel, who you'll see is a bit later on in the schedule, to talk about the kind of wider context of this and how this might fit into some other aspects of the mental health system. So Professor Lynn Gabriel, thank you so much. I wanted to begin by asking you both a question because I'm listening to various people talk on stage today, and I'm thinking a lot of this seems quite intuitive. A lot of it seems like common sense. So why haven't we done this already, is my question.
Such a good question.
Yeah.
Oh, you first.
I do get asked this all the time, actually. I was asked it on Radio 4 a few months ago, and it is a good question. On the outside of the system, you can understand. I mean, there's some evidence around this. So the WHO have done research into long-term outcomes for people with psychosis, and they find that in developing countries you actually do better than in the West, where they don't have mental health systems in terms of long-term outcomes. Now, why is that? Well, my family originally from Bangladesh. When I go back there, what happens if somebody enters a crisis? Everybody lives on the same street. Most of the extended family are there. So they all come together around the crisis and they have this dialogue. Sometimes it can be heated and sometimes distressing, but that's the beginning of their care. It happens before anything else. They don't go to a clinic and see a professional who tells them what's wrong with them. They start to work it out between them at the beginning. And that's what makes a big difference. And so, yes, it is intuitive. It is happening, in lots of parts of the world. And what, unfortunately, within the system it's different, though, because we think about, OK, you've come to me as a professional now, I'm going to have to fix you and tell you the answers. And that's the fundamental reason that within our system, we have a culture that's about us fixing people. And we can understand why that comes about. But in the end, it doesn't do the thing that we think we realise is really most obvious, which is actually creating a space where people can have that dialogue.
Yeah, I just think that's such a good question. And I think if I go back a number of decades as a trainee mental health nurse, I used to be disciplined for wanting to talk to the patients. So those conversational opportunities to have with people incarcerated in a mental institution were just discouraged. So to see something like ODDESSI coming across in recent decades, first in Finland, Nordic countries, now globally, and now importantly through Russell and Steve Pilling and other colleagues in the UK, that's such a breath of fresh air. And I think we have a precious, special moment right now that we're moving into, we're kind of on the cusp and moving into, that people like Norman Lamb, Mark, Minesh, many others, everybody in this room and associations that are represented here like BACP, UKCP, Royal College of Psychiatry. It's a relational wave and it has to gain momentum and we have to ride that wave together and essentially not take no for an answer. I think there are things configuring in the wider mental health, government, DHSC landscape that are playing beautifully to a relational, dialogical way of working. And everyone in this room, I think Norman's call to action to be more human, we all need to be more humane, compassionate, in a good way, activists promoting the value of something like open dialogue for people who haven't. We've heard your story, Rachel. Very powerful story, multiple stories. I'm sorry, I will stop in a minute. Apologies. But I think at the moment, that wave has brought through people like Deborah Moore, Tim, who you know, a psychiatrist, and also Liz Durant, bringing neighbourhood-based, community-based, high street-based mental health centres. That had to happen, and it took some brave souls really pushing at that, taking some risks, but that's there and it's in place. And now we have open dialogue coming in with its powerful relational stance. It's a thing of beauty, potentially, building those two together. So we have the operational, relational principles and practices that are now evidence-based in the UK for open dialogue. We have the operating framework with the centres. They need to be pulled together in some way so that they're working together, overtly working together. Sorry, Russell, I've gone on a bit. What you're doing, what you and colleagues and Kathy, who sat there in the front row, are doing is amazing work. And Rachel now is a peer support open dialogue practitioner. And it brings into a multidisciplinary landscape great opportunities for people. So my hat's, not that I've got one on today, hats off to you, Russell, and team. You've done a fabulous job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And now, I guess, with these 100 new mental health hubs that have been announced, now it really is the time to do this. Can you expand a little bit, either of you or both of you, on how those two things could work together?
Yeah, and I think there's an obvious synergy really, because on the one hand we have we've got an initiative here which is about moving care into the community and trying to make sure that people aren't having to move away from their homes into a hospital and into a very clinical environment. And it's very much about giving people a space where the continuity can be maintained and they can sustain those relationships even if they need a bed, and that bed can be closer to you in the community. So it's all about keeping things closer to home and empowering people locally. So it's not a million miles. It doesn't take a massive leap of faith to understand how open dialogue fits in with that very well, actually. So, in fact, a lot of this was based on a model in Trieste, in Italy, who started working this way. And a bunch of people in Trieste are open dialogue trained, and they use open dialogue in the way they deliver that model. So it makes a lot of sense. I remember actually having a meeting in NHS England with Tim about, I don't know what, it was about 5, 6 years ago now. And he was putting together the plans for the 24/7 hubs. And he said, when are you going to have your results? I said, well, it'll be a couple of years yet. But he said, oh, God. We could have put it in there otherwise. Is there any way you can hurry up? Well, you tell Steve, I don't think so. As you can see, he's not always on time, right? So, but what, in the end, unfortunately, the time is slightly mismatched. So they got the funding to set that up, which has happened, and now we've got the results. But hopefully we can move towards an integration because it's a very clear thing to do. My trust put a bid in, to be one of the 24/7 sites. I'm sure we'll do that again, and we put open dialogue at the heart of that. Unfortunately, there were too many London trusts who put bids in for the first wave, so we couldn't get on that. But we want to get on the next one, and again, we can showcase how we integrate that. Other sites like York, where Lynn is, are really keen to do the same. So I think we've got a real opportunity now to sort of start building that in to the way that this is rolled out. And now the government has announced, and Andy Burnham has talked a lot about mental health, actually, including on the steps of Downing Street when he first came in, and then immediately starts to release these funds to expand this. I think it's an opportunity, really, to integrate these different initiatives.
Definitely.
And that's wonderful. I mean, when Andy Burnham mentioned both education and mental health in his very first speech, I think a lot of us were like, yes. Yeah. So it does speak to a kind of, hopefully, a different direction. What needs to happen in order for this to be implemented? What would the steps be towards getting NHS staff, for example, trained in open dialogue?
Yeah, so good question. I mean, so one thing we can't pretend is that this is easy to do and that it's relatively painless and simple. It's not. It does require quite a bit of effort because the danger is people think that if let's do a CPD afternoon and you're all trained in open dialogue, right? That would be dangerous if we think that, because it's not. It's really not simple. So the first thing that happened back in 2013 is I had a long debate with the Finns, because the only open dialogue training they had was 3 years long, and Val and I were in the room with Jaakko, and he wasn't into the idea of doing a training that was less than 3 years. And I said, Jaakko, if you want this to be properly rolled out, if you want us to do some proper research on this, you have to find a way to deliver a basic training in less time than that. We can't put all clinicians through a 3-year training. So we agreed to put together a 1-year training, which involves sort of 4 one-week modules of training. Now, at the moment, it's all done residentially, but when we roll out, we'll do it. Some people will do the residential, some people will do it in-house in their own teams. But sort of 1 week time, 4 times a year, and we really teach, it's just a different way of being present with the patients that you see, and how to sort of connect with someone and make sure that all the different voices can be heard. We call it polyphony in open dialogue. We want polyphony, all different voices to be heard. And that is quite a skill, actually, to do that. And it requires a lot of self-restraint, a lot of self-awareness. A lot of the training is about self-awareness, to allow people to create that space. It does require a lot of work to do that. So the first thing is that training. But the good thing about the training is that when people go through that, they find that it really impacts their lives, really changes the way they are themselves with their family and friends and their life, and it has a big impact. So people come out of it actually becoming quite evangelical about it. It's interesting. We have trained over 1,000 people, and most of them become, head-banging evangelists. Which is great, yeah. And Steve noticed this early on. He said, "What happens in your training? All these people go into there sort of like, just average clinicians, and they come out of there screaming and, bellowing about open dialogue. What happens? Well, you have to come and see it." Still waiting for him to turn. It is a journey that people go through, and then the system has to go on a journey as well, because to convert it so that in the early days, I remember saying to our home treatment team managers, "Listen, I know it's not easy for you to release a member of staff for an hour for a meeting, right? An hour and a half, and you would have been you'd have seen 4 patients that time. But trust me, if you do this, then what you'll find is they're not requiring the daily visits as much, right? Because what we say to them at the end of the meeting is, now we've had this time, would you like to meet again? To which the answer is almost always yes. We might not be able to do it till the end of the week. Would you like to wait till then, or do you want to see somebody else from the home treatment team every day between now and then? The answer is almost always no, we don't want to see anybody else. We just want to see you guys, and we'll wait a couple of days because we want to have more meetings like this, especially when they're in crisis. So that's what makes the big difference, that ability to actually remain connected in that way. But it requires some real heavy lifting in the way you operationalise our service. At the moment, I'm just talking about across the country, the way we deliver mental health, it's not really patient-centred care, it's service-centred patients. So our patients have to work out how to navigate the service. But patient-centred care means the service follows the patient, which means that the flexibility, the boundaries between the teams need to be a lot more porous. So you can actually staff can move between teams to stay with the patient. That requires a lot of, heavy lifting to do. So those kind of things, is also involved in implementing open dialogue. But they are now, having seen the experience and having heard some of the results, people are now willing to do that on a larger scale, which is, I'll talk about that a bit at the end.
How much of this do you think is about autonomy? Because it strikes me, there's lots of similarities here. I go into schools all over the UK. I've never met a teacher who wasn't trying their best and really quite competent. And yet there are so many young people who say that they have a really bad experience of school. So then you think, okay, that there's something wrong with the system here that they're operating under. And what a lot of teachers say is that the system has taken away my autonomy. I can't do what comes naturally to me because I have to do what's been prescribed on this bit of paperwork. And this sounds quite similar. Is this about giving autonomy back to mental health workers in a lot of ways?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we often say this, that in order to create a space for service users, we first need to create a space for clinicians. So for us to say that, okay, we are trusting you in your lived experience to find your way forward and we're giving you that space, we have to do the same with clinicians. So it's not about, every time, I'm in management meetings, every time that someone comes up with a solution that involves another form, I think this is actually dangerous now, because we're just taking away from people's autonomy to just be present with what's happening and what's unfolding. So yeah, absolutely. It's taking away a lot of bureaucracy that is key to doing this.
Yeah, it's bringing in ways of working that have to shift from that bureaucratic form-ticking ethos, I guess, into ways of being, relating and working that place the person and their network, their family, their friends, their social worker, whoever it is that's with them, and enables them to be in relationship with key people like therapists, if it's in an OD context, open dialogue context, or in a neighbourhood mental health centre, similar but slightly different, where you might come in and meet a group of people right from the get-go, and you can drop in, and you don't have to fill out lots of forms, and you can have a conversation and be authentic, your authentic self, congruent in the moment without having to defend or be fearful or overly anxious about what's coming your way. And I think your story is shocking. One story and many, many more of that revolving door. And we just can't have that. So those old-fashioned practices have to change, definitely have to change.
Can I just ask if what's happening with time? So if Steve isn't here yet, then maybe I'll go ahead and divulge the results in that case. Because otherwise, when, we've got a finite amount of time.
I mean, I think you should.
Yeah.
For what it's worth.
Okay. Let me do that. Okay. If you wanna, can I come up there, actually?
I'll get off here.
That's right. If I come up there,
I'll
read. Yeah. Thanks. Whenever Steve comes back, then he can take over. But I'll start sort of by telling you the basic results. So there are some things that we look for in this trial and that we wanted to find and didn't find. But there are some things that we didn't really expect to find that we did that are certainly not my socks off at the extent to which we found them. And therefore opens a whole realm of possibilities up for the future for this. So in terms of a sort of a basic list, the first thing in the headline, and some of you have already heard these headlines in the news this morning, the most striking thing that we found is that your chances of having an admission, an inpatient admission after having an open dialogue is 3 times less than it was, actually 3.4 times less than in the treatment as usual group. So 3.4 times less chance of being admitted to hospital. All right. Now, we did this follow-up over 2 years. That's very unusual. You don't usually do mental health studies for 2 years. You usually do it for just a few weeks, or a couple of months. Most drug trials and other things are only for a short period of time. But we did 2 years of follow-up. We insisted on that follow-up. And so we collected this data about 1/3, when we found 1/3, 3 times less chance of being admitted to hospital with open dialogue. And we did that at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months, right? But when we found out that we're consistently seeing the odds of being admitted, if you have open dialogue, are 3 times less. So, well, let's go back at the data and let's look at the whole 2 years and find out what is the total time in hospital for the open dialogue patients compared to treatment as usual. We had to go back. This is why it's taken us so long to reveal the results, because we went back and re-looked at the data again and again. And what we found is that in total, the total amount of time you spend in open dialogue, if you've had open dialogue, is 54% less than treatment as usual. So you'll have 54% less time in hospital than treatment as usual. Okay? So you more than halved the amount of time people spend in hospital. In addition, we found that the referrals to crisis teams are also reduced, are also halved. So you're half as likely also to be referred in crisis. Now, what we didn't find was that the frequency of relapse was roughly the same. Okay, so the time it takes for you to relapse and become unwell again is about the same, and the frequency of episodes you have is about the same. So we're not removing any mental ill health, we're not completely curing people, but what we're saying is that when you do become unwell again, it won't be anything like as impactful or as intense or as consequential as it would have been, which means that you don't need crisis care anything like as much, you don't need to go into hospital anything like as much as you did before. And that is particularly significant because we see so many people, all those of us who work in acute mental health, we see so many people trapped in this revolving door of coming back in again and again. And it's so dispiriting after you've got someone better, you send them home and they're doing well and they're getting on with their lives, to see them back again and then again. And all those people who know about inpatients will see the same people bouncing back. This means that we've liberated people from that on many occasions, where actually, 54% less admissions into hospital means that if you've been in hospital, you're less likely to be bouncing back again and again. So while we didn't find that the episodes themselves are, reducing in number or it takes longer, we did find that actually the impact of that is a lot less. Underneath that, we find a whole load of other things in terms of why this is probably happening and what's important to patients. So, one of the things we measured, for example, is a sort of co-produced recovery measure, QoS, and what we did is, it's a series of things that people who've had lived experience of mental health have themselves described is important to them. So things like, I feel like I can make decisions better, I feel like I'm getting on better in relationships, I feel more in control of my life, I feel more confident in making decisions. All of those things improved in open dialogue compared to treatment as usual. So that your own measure of recovery improved in open dialogue compared to treatment as usual. Quality of life also improved in open dialogue compared to treatment as usual. So people experienced that they have better quality of life as a result of having open dialogue. That was a clear finding. And then also, we asked people what they feel about the services that they're receiving. And they scored open dialogue more highly than treatment as usual. So that they were clear that this is my satisfaction with this service is higher in open dialogue than in treatment as usual. So that was also very clear. That difference meant that it starts to make sense if you piece it all together. So if you think about how we've discussed how open dialogue works, people have this open space that they can start to use. They start to understand their own way to their own recovery. And because of that, they feel like the service we had was actually a better service because I was more in charge. Because of that flexibility and that sort of bespokeness that ends up happening with open dialogue, because there's a lot more permutations of how this can pan out depending on the people in the room, right? It's not just the same clinicians telling you what to do each time, right? So because of that bespokeness, they end up also having a better recovery. They feel like they're recovering better than they would have done otherwise. They also, therefore, have a better quality of life. Right? So that means that even if you do become unwell again, the consequences are a lot less. You don't end up bouncing into hospital. You don't end up getting into crisis again, anything like as often as before. So that shift in the consequences of mental ill health, like I say, what we proved is that we're not extinguishing mental ill health. We're not getting rid of it. We're not making people completely cured. But the consequences of it are so much less that it will allow people to get on with their lives and have that better quality of life. And we're going to do another paper on the health economics of open dialogue because Lancet isn't interested in money very much. So we've got another journal that we're going to publish that in. But so I can't tell you to go into that too much. But I think the math kind of does itself. 80% of mental health expenditure goes on to the 2% of people who are in hospital. Okay? If we halve that, then what's that going to do to costs? Okay? And so there's a little bit of expenditure involved in delivering open dialogue. But I think there's two important things to address here. And a little bit of expenditure is a one-off expense on training and that kind of stuff. Otherwise, not. Two things to address here. One is that this study was a randomized controlled trial, a cluster randomized controlled trial, which Steve will have talked more about. But what that essentially means is that what we did is that, take for example an area like Havering where I work, we formed clusters within that locality of equivalent morbidity, so equivalent referral rates into the service, equivalent hospitalisation rates, etc., based on GP surgery. So we formed clusters. And then what we did is we randomized those clusters so that a couple of those clusters would be open dialogue, a couple of them would be treatment as usual. So it's randomly determined. So we know that the consequences of this are not due to anything else. They're just due to the open dialogue. Now, what we couldn't do is blind it. If you have open dialogue, you're having open dialogue, right? You can't be blinded to that. You can't do a placebo with this study, right? So there was no, there was a control group, those people who didn't have open dialogue, but it wasn't blinded. Now, Some people might say, well, it wasn't blinded, so how do we know that because they knew they had open dialogue, it didn't affect the results? Well, the thing is that anybody who works in acute services knows that no one is going to make a decision. If you're at the point of hospitalisation, no one's going to say, oh, you're having open dialogue, okay, then you don't need to be admitted. It's not going to work like that, right? So the lack of blinding will not impact things like hospitalisation rates, okay? It won't make any difference to that. The lack of blinding will also not affect, for example, your quality of life scores. Right? You're not going to suddenly decide because I know I'm having this, my quality of life. Your quality of life is dependent on a whole range of things that you're asked about in your life, which is the same with patient recovery. That's not going to, have anything to do with whether you're blinded or not. It's like, can I make decisions better? Are my relationships better? Again, that's nothing to do with the lack of blinding. Your experience of care is also nothing to do with lack of blinding because you're going to rate your care as you see it, and we can trust people to do that, even if they know they may be having open dialogue or treatment as usual. So the lack of blinding, I think, should not have had any effect on these measures that we found such a big difference in. The other thing is, were open dialogue teams better resourced, than treatment as usual? And the answer is no, absolutely not. You can't really go to your trust, and some of my trust leaders here, we can't go to your trust and say, can you give me an extra bag of money so I can do this research on these teams and prove that they're better? No one's going to give you that money. We didn't have any extra resource. All our teams had the same amount, of very stressful, work that everybody else had. We all had our caseloads. We all had, a lot of emergencies and crises to deal with all the time, and we made sure on purpose that the way we divided the teams up, that I remember when I did this with my own team, we hived off a section of our own team in order to fund the open dialogue team, and we made sure they took their fair share of caseloads with them. Right? So it wouldn't never be the case that these guys have an easy life and more resources to deal with it. All right? So the resource allocation was the same between both arms of the trial, and there wasn't any case of being more resource. So open dialogue, these results that we found didn't happen because open dialogue was better resourced, but it happened because open dialogue was better connected. So the people were then trained to connect better to each other as clinicians as well as to their patients. And it's that connection that made the difference. One thing that we didn't put in the paper, and we're now retrospectively looking at data so we can officially publish this, but it is a fact, and we've already been talking about this, is that staff retention rates were far higher in the open dialogue teams compared to treatment as usual. In my own service in Havering, between 2017 and 2023, there was 100% turnover in the control group team. In other words, everybody in the team in 2023 had been recruited since 2017. All the people from 2017 had left and been replaced in those 6 years. Right? There's 100% turnover of staff. In the open dialogue team, that was a 20% turnover of staff. Only a couple of people left. The reason even they left is because we're a small team, so if you want to go up to a band 7 or a higher band, you had to leave the team. So it was actually with a great deal of regret that some of our great colleagues had to leave. They would have stayed if it was a bigger service, right? So that's the difference between a 20% turnover and a 100% turnover of staff. And when I remember talking about that to sort of Gareth from one of the teams and colleagues from different teams, they all said, it's exactly the same in our service. Our folks are sticking around and so much different to the other. And trust leaders were often saying, how did you do that? How did you do that? When you go through this training, it creates a really cohesive team. We learn a lot about each other. We do genograms together, family of origin work. We learn about each other. We know what's pressing each other's buttons. We're there for each other. We do that work on an ongoing basis in the team. So we're forging connections between each other, and forging connections with our patients, which is what keeps us in the work, keeps us connected. So although we don't have more resource, we do have more consistent staff. But that's happened because of open dialogue, because of the training, because of the way we brought people together. So, these results, as I say, there's a range of results. Other things in terms of, how many people were involved in social networks. We found that increased a little bit in open dialogue, but not in meetings, a little bit, but not hugely. But almost certainly part of the reason for that is that we measured every single meeting. And it's only that you bring people together in the network meetings. So when you average out, it might look like the numbers are roughly the same, but the network meetings had more people in. And also, in this country, we don't have the culture of involving families as much. So it would often take quite a few meetings before they got involved. They'd often come on their own, and then gradually you would start asking about other people, and then they might invite their mother or their brother, so that would build. Which is why the numbers don't look too different, but there's a reason for that, because of the way we delivered and the culture and the background here as well. So that shift was smaller. But overall, like I say, the big change and the thing that's being reported in the news now, understandably, is the fact that there was this substantial drop in inpatient use. But we can't pretend that at the same time we showed that people aren't relapsing and becoming unwell at roughly the same rate. That's also true. So we have to say both of those things. And so what I'd like to talk about at some point is about next steps. I'm just wondering, there's still no sign of Steve? Is that okay? In that case, this has literally happened to me before, in previous conferences, when halfway through and Steve is delayed. Something that happens with Steve when it comes to time from international meetings. So I've been at international meetings, and Steve's been exactly an hour or two late because he was looking at the wrong time zone. Eh? All right, we've got to. Oh, okay, excellent. So what I suggested then, we might bring Tommy on now, and then I'll say something at the end about implementation. That's probably the best way to do it. Tommy, I'll let Natasha introduce Tommy, actually. The Lancet actually asked for a commentary piece on open dialogue, so they asked for a very distinguished academic to do that. Tommy is here with us today. So if I hand over to Natasha to introduce Tommy, and then we'll hear from Tommy next.
Thank you so much. As Russell said, there are few academics who have spent more time scientifically evaluating holistic models of care like open dialogue than Dr. Tommy Bergström. He's a distinguished academic with a strong track record in this area, and that's why the Lancet approached him to write a commentary piece on the ODDESSI paper in their journal. His perspective is highly valued in this area, and we are delighted to welcome him today live from Helsinki. Everyone cross your fingers.
Okay, hello. Do you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm also happy, Russell, that you were finally able to share those results. You had been keeping them by yourself for some time, so, and I don't have to avoid any spoiler alerts now. Okay. So my name is Tommy Bergström, and I am a psychologist. I work here in Finland in psychiatric services in Helsinki. And I'm also a former head psychologist of Keropudas Hospital, where open dialogue was developed. And alongside my clinical work, I have studied open dialogue using different research methods, mainly these register-based outcome studies using Finnish national registers. And today I'm here, as you said, because the Lancet invited me to write this short commentary on ODDESSI trial. And in this commentary, I try to discuss some issues that there wasn't really space in that original article. And first, few words about that study design. So in psychiatry, there has been usually a strong focus on these individually randomized trials. And there is, of course, good reason for this, because without randomization, it would be much more difficult to know whether an outcome is really caused by treatment or by something else. But these trials also require us to define exactly what the treatment is and what outcome we want to measure. And this can be a little tricky in mental health service, as there are many things happening at the same time, and it's difficult to know exactly what is helping people. In fact, if we look research, good outcome in mental health care are often related to so-called common factors, rather than to one specific intervention. And one of the most important factors is the relationship that has been also talked today with the person who is seeking help. Do they feel heard? Do they feel that they are being helped? And how they experience the treatment itself? And these are the things that open dialogue focuses. And this is also why open dialogue is so difficult to study with these individually randomized trials. Because open dialogue is not one specific intervention or a specific method, but instead it is a way of organizing the whole process of care. Basically, treatment begins with this low threshold for dialogue. We meet people immediately. We don't start by deciding what the problem is and then assigning a person, for example, to specialized units or predefined treatments. But instead, we begin by trying to create this shared understanding of current situation in dialogue together with people who are seeking help and their social networks. And the same team remains responsible throughout this whole process. And then after that, different methods and interventions can be used if they are needed based on this shared understanding created in dialogue. So basically, open dialogue does not really operate at the level of one individual service user. It operates at the level of whole team. And this is why cluster randomized design used in ODDESSI is probably the most practical way to study open dialogue. As Russell said, teams are first randomly assigned either to open dialogue or to treatment as usual groups, and then we see what happens in a real-life service. In other words, this design tells us what actually happens when team receive, for example, open dialogue training and start working in this way. And this also helps to overcome one of the major challenges with individualized RCTs. Even though they produce evidence on effectiveness of specific treatment to specific symptoms, when we bring these same treatments into everyday practice, it may work somewhat differently. But in a cluster trial like ODDESSI, we are already studying what happens when whole team changes the way it works in a real-life mental health service. So this gives us very valuable information about real clinical practice. And then we come to these outcomes. And as Russell said, overall outcomes were favorable, but there was no difference in this time to relapse variable, which was primary variable in this study. And the main point of my Lancet commentary is whether this primary outcome actually measures what we want open dialogue to achieve. First, one of the central ideas of open dialogue is to have this very low threshold for seeking help. Basically, people are encouraged to talk about difficult experiences and contact the same team again if things become more difficult. So we should ask whether the time before someone expresses more distress or contacts services again is best indicator of effectiveness of this approach. Because open dialogue may actually encourage people to express suffering more openly and make contact. It's part of the treatment process itself. And at the same time, person may be doing much better in the longer term. They may need less inpatient treatment or specialized care. They may function better in everyday life and feel better overall. And ODDESSI gives us important evidence in these areas. And these are the kinds of outcomes that I personally think that we should aim for in mental health care, rather than focusing on managing specific symptoms over a certain period of time. I think it's more important to strengthen people's agency, activate their communities and their resources, and reduce the reliance on these resource-intensive inpatient or specialized services over long term. And this could in turn free up resources to facilitate more immediate dialogical encounters closer to people's real-life context, while reserving these more resource-intensive treatments for those who actually requires them. Similar findings have been seen in earlier studies. And when we go all the way back in the 80s, in the original catchment area in Keropudas Hospital in southwestern Lapland, the demand of mental health service was growing back then. And as somebody already said, the treatment results back then were also very poor, and available resources were also limited. And in response to this, they gradually started to reorganize services and systematically study what was working and what was not. And over time, this combination of research and clinical practice led to development of these main principles of open dialogue. And as part of this research, they also conducted pre-post evaluations of mental health service. And these evaluations produce findings very similar to those reported in ODDESSI study. But unlike ODDESSI, these earlier studies were observational, and it made it difficult to determine what was actually driving these favorable outcomes. So, as has been said, ODDESSI is the first study to examine this in more strictly controlled design, and it provides stronger evidence that organizing services and working according to these principles is actually associated with these kinds of outcomes. Nevertheless, we have conducted later nationwide register studies here in Finland, and we have also used statistical adjustment for observable confounders. In these studies, we compare people who began treatment within open dialogue system in Western Lapland with those who began treatment elsewhere in Finland, where psychiatric services has been more conventional. And in these studies, we have also seen long-term findings very similar to ODDESSI. There has been less use of inpatient treatment and less need for specialized mental health services over time, which also helps to optimize resources. There has also been less use of psychotropic medication, which can reduce the risk of harmful side effects. There have also been strong indications of better functional outcomes and lower costs. And we are also seeing similar findings in other countries now, including, for example, United States, Italy, Germany, Norway, and Denmark, where staff have been trained in open dialogue in some parts of the services. And we see somewhat similar results in those studies. And earlier research has also shown similar high satisfaction with services. Basically, in open dialogue system, people have often felt that the treatment actually helped them. And I think this should, of course, be a central priority in mental health care, because what we are fundamentally responding to is subjectively experienced distress, difficult and overwhelming feelings, and situations in which people feel that they no longer manage on their own without support of others. But the important point here that I want to make is that at the beginning, open dialogue and the way of how it's work may be more intensive. So people are encouraged to express difficulties, and because of this low threshold, someone may contact services again and again quite quickly, and still they may do much better in the longer term. And as I said, this means that time from first recovery to first relapse may not be the best measure for this kind of approach. And I think there are now good opportunities to analyze the ODDESSI data further and understand this better. But there is also another side to this. If you want findings like these to become part of broader discussion in psychiatry, you need outcome measures that are established and widely recognized in the field. So using these established outcome measures may have been necessary to bring open dialogue into this kind of conversation in the first place that we have right here, right now. So to think together, how should approaches like open dialogue be studied? What should we measure? And most importantly, what should the main aim of mental health services be? Is the main aim to manage symptoms over a certain time frame, or to maximize the time before someone asks help again? Or do we want people regain control of their lives, activate their own resources and social networks, need less professional help over time, and feel that help they receive is actually helpful? I think these questions shows the real value of ODDESSI trial also. Because good research doesn't only give us answers, it also increases curiosity, raises new questions, and gives us opportunity to learn. And finally, I like to use this opportunity right here for a small advertisement with clear conflict of interest, of course. Tomorrow, my new book, Holistic Psychiatry, will be published. And in this book, I try to develop this broader way of thinking about mental health care. How do we understand situations that are diagnosed as mental disorders? How does that understanding affect the way we help people? And how does it affect what we choose to study and measure? So these things are connected. The way we understand these situations and what we consider a good outcome affects directly the way how we organize our mental health services. And in this book, I also provide very practical and concrete guidance for mental health professionals and leaders and policymakers on how we can start developing these approaches with realities and constraints of our current systems. I hope this framework could help also bring approaches like open dialogue into everyday work of mental health services in a more sustainable way. So instead of being seen as a separate or alternative intervention, its principles could become part of how mental health service normally operates. And I'd like to mention that this is also a direction that, for example, World Health Organization has been promoting for many years now through its guidance on developing more holistic rights and community-based mental health services, with open dialogue already included as one example of such services. And then we also need to think about how we study these services, how we measure things that actually matter to people, because what gets measured gets also managed. So I don't see ODDESSI as an endpoint. I see it as a beginning. It gives us opportunity to ask better questions about what mental health services are for, how we should study them, and what outcomes really matter to people and society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tommy Bergström. Now, I'm delighted to be able to welcome next, also via the screen, Professor Steve Pilling. As Chief Investigator of the ODDESSI trial at UCL, Professor Pilling has been leading on the evaluation of open dialogue in the UK for more than a decade now. This research is a landmark in Professor Pilling's long and distinguished academic career as Head of Clinical Psychology at UCL, and he's also the lead for mental health at NICE. It is therefore with great pleasure that I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker for the day, Professor Steve Pilling.
Very generous introduction. And I think I might be in need of some family intervention as my wife walked off with my phone and B, I'm dialing in from France and the bloody internet wasn't working properly. So my apologies for the late arrival, but hopefully I can get through my slides. And you could argue it would have been better if Tommy came after my presentation, but actually I think I think I heard most of your talk, Tommy, and I think it sets a nice frame for the discussion of the ODDESSI results and where we go further. So could I ask who's sharing screen to put up the slides, unless I'm supposed to be doing this myself?
Steve, we can see your screen, so you can do it yourself.
I can share, okay.
Yeah.
Can you see them now? No? Let me just...
If you try one more time.
Yeah. I think I might have managed it. Let's see. Brilliant.
Yeah, we can see them now.
Go back to the beginning, which would rather help. Okay, if I can just move this, so just bear with me a second. Okay, I hope that that's visible. Is that correct? Yes. Oh, can people?
Yeah, we can see it perfectly.
Brilliant, brilliant. Apologies. Okay, so as has been said, ODDESSI trial, a good 8-10 years of work building up to this point. And I think in addition to that rather generous introduction, one thing that might have been missing from it is that I spent quite a part of my career looking at different models of effective service provision, crisis teams, assertive outreach teams. And so I've got a lot of experience of trying to understand how service level interventions can really contribute to the wider improvement of mental health services. But as I'll say in my introduction, if I can get the next slide to come up, that actually we really have struggled, I think, in the UK to arrive at an effective means of the delivery of care for people, particularly with severe mental illness. I think we've made some significant improvements elsewhere around common mental disorders. And to pick up on what Tommy was saying, what really attracted me in early discussions with Russell and colleagues was that open dialogue was both an organizational intervention and a therapeutic intervention. And that bringing those two together is something that we have really struggled with in the UK healthcare system. This is what you already know, and it sets out what we attempted to do. Building on the work of Jaakko Sakulu and colleagues, we wanted to try and see if we could learn from what had been done in Finland and elsewhere, but build a stronger evidence base for it. As Tommy set out, we lacked the kind of RCTs that certainly in my work for NICE are a powerful determinant of whether or not interventions are adopted by NICE. And they are something by which I have myself spent a lot of time arguing with pharma about the quality of trials that are advanced to support the use of different pharmacological interventions. So I think it was important that we try to look at it in a way which increased the strength of the evidence base. It's a psychologically informed way of delivering treatment, which doesn't have just an individual focus, but has a wider family and network focus. And that is also the focus of the intervention. I won't repeat much of what Tommy said, but as people will know, that the primary delivery of quotes treatment is via network meetings, including patients and families. There's an emphasis on acceptability and flexibility of response, and there's a recognition that the team, working as a team, team-based supervision is central to the effectiveness of it. And that in itself presents some challenges when you come to evaluate it in a trial. As Tommy set out, the obvious way to do this was through a cluster randomized trial. Initially, we were going to get through this in 5 years, but COVID came along, and that presented a real challenge. Kat Clark, who I think is somewhere in the audience here, did a brilliant job of helping us adjust what we were delivering in open dialogue face-to-face into something that you could deal with remotely. And as I'll come on to say later, I think despite the challenges, we were able, by and large, to retain fidelity and adherence to the model, despite the challenges that COVID presented. We stopped recruitment in COVID, but we continued delivering the intervention to those already in the trial. There were 5 work packages. I'll touch on them later. And I should just jump ahead a little here, but I've been responsible in other roles, one being advising the Department of Health on the structure of mental health services, particularly people with severe mental illness, and was responsible some 20 or so years ago for developing what we called the functional team model, where we had a crisis team, a core community team, an assertive outreach team, a first episode team, and that it solved some problems, but it created others. And we wanted to try and address the issue of how the overall organization of services might be better developed and influenced by open dialogue. And the way to do that was to focus on people presenting in crisis. It was a cluster randomized trial. Tommy's touched on them. I won't need to say much more about it. One thing that was different about open dialogue than a lot of other trials, including trials I'd been involved in, it included a more representative population, if you want to call it that, from the English healthcare system. A lot of the trials have been done in centres like in London, in Manchester, and elsewhere. And the population tends to be skewed, if you could use that term appropriately, to a population with probably more of the severe illness that you see in the inner cities. And I felt that if we were going to have generalizability for the trial, we wanted to be looking more than what happens in North London, South London, or Manchester. And we wanted to also not do too much to change the way we deliver the program. And so we took the core community mental health team as our building blocks, but introduced into that peer support workers and OD training that Russell and Mark ran. We were also required, I mentioned fidelity and adherence. I'll give you a quick definition and then explain why we wanted them in there. Fidelity is, what is the structure of the overall service? Is that structure of the overall service in line with what you would expect if you're providing good quality community care, good quality open dialogue? And adherence is about the nature of the intervention, specifically the open dialogue intervention. The former in this overall case is probably the most important because what NIHR, National Institute for Health Research, who funded the study, wanted to be clear about is that we were comparing this new treatment, open dialogue, against good quality standard treatment. And we were required to maintain a level of, if you like, service fidelity or quality in order to make sure it was a fair comparison. And if we fell below standards on either arm and could not remediate, could not improve it, we had to drop that cluster or stop the trial. Fortunately, we maintained fidelity and that did not occur. But it's I think, a strength of the study that we've some reason to believe that we did provide what we went out to provide. So I've already covered this, but we recruited people to the trial, which were all diagnostic groups presenting in crisis to mental health services. And that was deliberate. We wanted to be seen to be dealing with the wide range of people who come to mental health services. Again, interestingly, when I'd been involved in other studies with Sonia Johnson, other colleagues here at UCL, we'd seen 40 or 50% of people presenting in crisis to mental health services having a psychotic bipolar diagnosis. In this trial, and this is important to keep in mind, it was very different. It was barely 20%. But that's probably more representative of the country, but it relates, as I'll come on to a little later, onto our issue of our primary outcome. I've mentioned the cluster randomized model. They're the dates that we recruited from, and recruited nearly 500 people to the trial. We were okay, really, then in terms of power. And the other thing I wanted to be able to do was to have a reasonable outcome, a 2-year follow-up on our primary outcome, time to relapse after recovery. We had 93.5%. So that's really rather excellent data on which to come to an interesting conclusion, which I'll come to in a minute. But we just didn't collect data on relapse and recovery. We wanted to look at network attendance. Given the centrality of the social network in open dialogue, we wanted to make sure that we were able to measure that, to comment and look at how that might relate to the overall outcome. We were interested in how well engaged our community teams were, who engagement was made by and with whom. It's interesting, when I first met Russell and Ben Smith, I don't know, 10 years ago, one thing that really struck me listening to them at that time, that open dialogue represented a good way to get psychiatry more involved. And that seemed a strange thing to be saying, but I did feel that there were some sort of disconnects about how our services operated. And I'm jumping ahead to results here, but what was quite interesting is in the open dialogue arm, compared to treatment as usual, we had two things. We had more psychiatric involvement, and we had less medication prescribed. I'd rephrase that latter phrase, and I'd say we probably had more appropriate prescribing of medication. I think we just had better psychiatric involvement. We wanted to know what happened in network meetings, when they were held, who attended, what was their duration. I mentioned adherence and fidelity, and we wanted also to look at the provision both of pharmacological and psychological interventions. A number of people here worked pretty hard ploughing through a large electronic medical records to extract this data. So there's a bunch of research assistants, Emma and others who are on the call here today, to whom I'm eternally grateful. The primary outcome was a time to recovery after initial, time to relapse, after initial recovery, developed by Tom Craig and Paul Bebbington for a first episode psychosis study in South London some years ago. It was a nice measure to choose from a statistical point of view. It's a continuous measure. It gave us a little bit more power than a dichotomous measure might have done, but it was based on I think I'm entirely responsible for this, a mistaken assumption about the prevalence of people with psychosis in this study. I expected it to be perhaps nearer the 30, 40, 50% that I'd seen in studies I've been involved in over the last 20 or more years. But actually, if you move outside London, you do get different populations presenting in crisis. And one of the problems with our primary outcome is that probably on reflection, it was not the best choice. But as you see, we also, I think, a reflection of the population, had a large number of people who didn't relapse. So our numbers that we had available for that primary outcome were rather different, rather smaller than we'd expected. But and this is an important thing. As was said in the introduction, I spend quite a lot of my time working with NICE. It's a day a week at the moment, but it seems quite a lot. And we're very keen in randomized controlled trials to be focused on the primary outcome. and to be not going fishing for results in a whole bunch of secondary outcomes. So we have to take what we find here seriously, that it was not statistically significant. In discussions with Lancet Psychiatry, they were very clear that we had to be calling this, quote, a null trial. So I'll just leave that there with I think the acknowledgement that maybe it wasn't the best choice of outcomes, but it's the one we have, and it does colour the way in which we present the results of the study going forward. Secondary outcomes, it's a very different and very interesting story here. As you probably, I think, sorry, somebody's banging at the door. I know not why. I'm just going to have to pop out for a second. Hello? Okay, I can't see them. They're going to have to wait. I think it's a delivery. Forget it. Okay. Oh, no, they're still back. Sorry, I'm going to have to go.
Okay. It's interesting that Professor Pilling was talking about the primary outcome measure there, because when I read the study, that was one of my questions, because I was thinking, well, it was tested on people with psychosis, but it seems to work for other mental health issues as well. And yet, right at the beginning of the study, it says that this was the weakness, but it's because of the measuring it by the distance to relapse, or the time to relapse, as opposed to how often people reach crisis, or I guess the measuring the time to relapse rather than the depth of the relapse, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which is a shame, because all the other results are brilliant. Are you back, Professor Pilling?
I'm back, actually.
Right.
Sorry, was a very insistent man from the post office. And he would just get banging. Okay, so I think one of the really most interesting findings here is in terms of the reduced use of inpatient beds. I think Russell may have mentioned this at the beginning, where you can see it's less than half inpatient bed days used by people in open dialogue compared to treatment as usual. In the context of the English healthcare system, that's an important finding. Those of you who work in that system now will know that we consume quite a lot of resource in the English healthcare system, because we're not able to contain every person that needs a hospital admission within our own catchment area, and we make quite a lot of use of expensive, out of area private beds. So from an economic point of view, and that's not the only issue here, it's a really quite important finding. What is interesting, though, is that if you were admitted, there was no difference essentially in the length of stay, whether you're in open dialogue or in treatment as usual. And that, just to cut back a bit, that relates to one of the challenges that we've often discussed in the ODDESSI team, is in contrast to what happens, for example, in Sweden, that in-reach between community and inpatient services is not really there. A lot of cases, when I was a lot less grey-haired, I used to work in community teams that also covered the inpatient beds for that particular patch. And I think there's a lot of value to that. It's still there with open dialogue, but that might partly account for it. And as you can also see from there was in terms of re-referral to crisis services, that was again significantly reduced. In terms of health-related quality of life and significant benefits for the ODDESSI arm, open dialogue arm of the trial. You can also see similarly, so from there were defined recovery, better results, service user satisfaction, better results. We were very interested in looking at the shared decision making, and again, I fess up to this error on my part. I think we chose the wrong measure for this, and so our data at 24 months, we tested at 3, 6, and 24 months, was not really up to the standard that we wanted for the statistical analysis, so we had to drop that. But what we saw from the early 3 and 6 month data looked rather promising, and again, we can see a difference in terms of burden on caregivers. So in terms of a lot of our secondary outcomes, there's a very positive picture emerges. The health economics, you'll be unsurprised to learn from that difference in bed days, which hugely drive the cost of healthcare, mental health care services, also looks very promising. The problem, or maybe the advantage with papers like Lancet, which are leading international journals, is that they don't publish health economics, because what might be cost effective, say here in England, or I should say here in France, where I am at the moment, might not be cost effective in, for example, in a less economically rich country, and certainly there'll be things that are rated as cost effectiveness in the US that we would never dream of being able to provide. So that's going to be a separate one, but I think it tells an important story, that there is significant savings, and those savings are driven almost entirely by bed usage. What we were also interested in, particularly the network model, is what are the mediators of change? What is it that brings about a change in overall, in a sense, what's the mechanism by which open dialogue may work? And we were particularly interested in whether or not the network itself were perceived to be providing an individual with support. We're looking at the rather more quant side of it in terms of the LNS6 and the SP. It's quite widely used measures. And here we didn't really see anything in terms of a significant difference. You can see the p-values at the bottom there are really nowhere near, well, 0.6 might be just about getting there. But and that is something I'll come back to at the end. So just understanding how ODDESSI works, I think, is quite important. And the reason for that is, if you have a better understanding why something may be effective, you have a better chance of being able to replicate it. So that was a bit troubling. You'll may hear more about the training that Mark and Russell developed, and it was very much modeled on the principles which, again, Tommy has spoken about, the principles underpinning open dialogue. But in contrast to, say, what Jaakko and colleagues have been doing in West Lapland, which had a strong systemic family intervention, we didn't have that as part of the ODDESSI program. And it could be argued, I'm not sure it's true or not, but it's certainly an argument to be had, as whether or not the absence of those may be reflected in the lack of a difference on the primary outcome. Although if we'd have stuck true to colours, we would have seen both arms being able to provide family interventions. I'll touch back on that in a minute later. But I also think that we might have found a situation where, because of the way in which open dialogues work with families, we may have got better engagement in families. We had a single approach to care, which very much mirrored the approach in Finland. It also actually really fitted with what we wanted to see emerging in the community mental health front, which I may turn back to the end. We had, though, in contrast, really limited peer support. We worked very hard, some excellent people helping us develop a peer support approach and peer support training, but that didn't really embed as we'd have wanted to see it happen in ODDESSI. And likewise, the percentage numbers, sometimes down to 20% of families involved in network meetings, was less than we had hoped for. I mean, certain people were certainly encouraged and efforts were made, but somehow I don't think we quite got there. And again, I'm mentioning specific family interventions. It was less than 10% in ODDESSI. So there were some things about aspects of the delivery of particular treatments or interventions that were different. And so I've just summarized it there. The differences are we managed fidelity to the model. We had a relative limitation on network meetings and in people involved in them. That often we didn't always have, for example, 2 healthcare professionals involved in the meeting, and we had an absence of psychological interventions, and they just need to be considered in the context of the overall program's effectiveness. Now I come to my last slide, and this might help set up some of the discussions for later or not, but I called it a 10-point plan because we've got 10 points. The first one is another RCT needed, or indeed is it possible? Can we persuade on the basis of the results that we have got so far for NIHR to put another £3 or £4 million into another trial? Or would it be, and I think Tommy was arguing for this, hope I'm not misrepresenting Tommy, but whether we look more to the evaluation of large-scale implementation studies. I think we should. I've spent quite a bit of my time over the last 10 years looking at very large data sets from the NHS Talking Therapies programme. And in fact, we've been doing some more work recently with target trial methodologies, mirroring RCT methods. So I think there's probably better value to be got from focusing on large-scale implementation studies rather than further RCTs. Others may have a different view. I certainly think we need to be looking about how we get increased network involvement. We didn't get really near the levels of network involvement that you see in the Finnish and potentially in some other European studies as well.
We have about 5
Likewise, peer support. I think we need to be upping that. We've done some excellent training programs for peer support workers. We've had some excellent peer support workers, but actually their presence in some of it was less than we would have wanted.
Professor Pilling, just to let you know, we have about 5 minutes left, if that's okay.
That's perfect, because I will be finished in about 2.
Okay.
So even moments for a question, or it could be 3 minutes blessed relief, and people can stop me here droning on. But anyway, I'll get through it. I think we do need to look at the increased availability of effective psychological. When I was drafting the paper, I emailed Jaco and said, look, is it right? You were really delivering family interventions pretty much all the time. And he said, yes. And I think we need to be thinking about the range of psychological interventions in there. The other thing that, again, we struggled with, and Russell may comment on this, I think we could do with better links with inpatient services. I think the separation that we have in the English system now, essentially between inpatient care and care in the community, is not good. And I think we should be thinking about that. We need to better characterise what staff have been doing. And one way that we've often dealt with this, I've done a lot of work for the Department of Health elsewhere, we've developed competence frameworks which sort of draw on the trial manuals to try and characterise what are the things that staff really need to be doing to deliver an intervention effectively, and we need to revise our training programs on the basis of that. We need more routine outcome measurement, not just to be able to look overall at the effectiveness of what we're doing, but to guide individual care as well. And then finally, and I think this is a really important one, our bet was that it was the engagement of members of the network that would be the mediating factor in bringing about change in open dialogue. And I think our results suggest, at least in the UK setting, that's probably not the case. And I think and others will comment on this no doubt through the day, I think looking at how teams function, how people feel enabled to engage in discussions, how people can tolerate more uncertainty. I think looking at team function is going to be potentially a better way to understand the mediators of change in open dialogue than we have got so far in ODDESSI. So to quickly summarize, I want to say 3 things. First of all, to all the people on this call who were involved from a long time ago up until the present day in developing and delivering the trial, I'm very grateful. I think that that's the first point. The second point is, I do think what we've got here advances the evidence base for open dialogue. And my third point is, it also raises some challenges about how, A, we better deliver open dialogue, and I think we can do a better job, and related to that, how better we can go about assessing it. But I think we've got a pretty good starting point, but challenges lie ahead. And on that point, I'll stop. Thank you very much, and apologies for my late arrival.
Thank you so much. Professor Steve pilling there with the data and the analysis that we were all waiting for. Before we move on to our next guest, I just wanted to also acknowledge John Levitt, the Chief Executive of UKCP, is in the front row here. Both he and Lynn Gabriel, who we heard from earlier, represent psychotherapists and counsellors. And it's wonderful to have so many organisations joining forces today to support this. Our next speaker is the head of mental health neighbourhood mental health centres and leads on the 24/7 neighbourhood community hubs. As we've said several times throughout this event today, earlier in this month, the Prime Minister announced the biggest overhaul to England's mental health services in a generation. So please welcome Deborah Moore to tell us what that change could look like.
Share my screen with you. Full screen. Okay, unless I hear anything, I'm hoping that everybody can see that and hear me.
We can see your slides, Deborah.
Thank you. It's very kind of you to confirm. So good morning, and thank you for inviting me to what is clearly a very important event. I've been asked to talk about the policy direction for mental health and the move towards more holistic local provision and the synergies between that and an open dialogue approach, and also, I hope, if you may indulge me, why I believe we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to leap forward in a quest for what's been described as a bold, reimagined future. I lead the National Programme for Neighbourhood Mental Health Centres and have done now for just over 2 years. And I've worked in health and social care now for probably over 40 years. But I also come to this as a daughter whose mum experienced mental health services for more than 5 decades. I guess the way you think about policy is the way that I do, always with the person in mind. And I'm always conscious that policy can sound abstract, frameworks, standards, models, programmes. But we all know that ultimately it's experienced by a person, a family and a community. Today, I want to share just a little of my family story because I think it brings to life the policy journey so far, what has changed, what's not changed enough, and why the next stage needs to be different, and how approaches like open dialogue offer us new hope. Personally, my starting point is fairly simple. Mental health care is not only about treating illness, it's about helping people to live a good life. In the neighbourhood space, we often talk about people having somewhere to live, someone to love, something to do, and the rights and the resources to participate in what many of us consider to be an ordinary life. Our photograph in the centre, the black and white one, is Middlewood Hospital in Sheffield, where my mum was first admitted, and that was in the late 60s. She received care there for a serious mental illness. The other photos are of my mum and dad around that same time that she was first admitted, and me and my younger sister. Over 50 years, my mum experienced successive waves of reform. Buildings were closed, services were moved, and policies changed. There was real progress, but changing the location of care did not automatically change his experience. We found that institutional thinking often prevailed, decisions were made about us, without us, relationships and family life was disrupted, and mum often was understood only through diagnosis and risk. This is why Desmond Tutu's words matter to me. Mental health care is fundamentally, I'm sure for all of us, an encounter between human beings. Relationships and continuity are not soft options or soft additions. They are often the very things that make safety and recovery possible. My mum's story, therefore, raises a wider question. After decades of reform, have we changed not only where care happens, but how people experience being cared for? I created this slide a while ago because I was trying to think about the story or the journey that we've taken to where we are now. And, you know, hopefully, ambitiously, optimistically, I hope that it's a story about changing where care happens to how people are seen and supported going forward. Many of you will be familiar with these high-level changes. It's not an extensive or comprehensive list, it's just some of the headlines. But this is a journey that took place within my mum's lifetime. The 1970s saw challenges to institutional care, and through various scandals, we saw that a light was shone in dark corners. Some may recall that this resulted in a series of white papers calling for better care, not just for people with mental illness, but older people and people with learning disabilities. In the 1980s, we saw an acceleration of the move from institutions to the community, and this was underpinned by the legislation, some of which is highlighted there. In the 90s, we saw that community mental health services were strengthened and built on, and at the turn of the century, a much needed emphasis on equality, human rights and choice. A decade later, we saw some really significant investment. Each era for my mum and for us, and I'm sure for many others, brought progress, but much of the focus was on changing where care happened or how services were organised. The challenge of this decade and beyond, I think, is deeper, with citizenship and belonging central. Really changing how people are seen and supported. And this does not mean pretending that inpatient care will never be needed, or that access to timely, evidence-based treatment is not paramount. What it does mean, though, is that when someone does need an admission to hospital, that it should be close to home, therapeutic and compassionate. You'll note that my last note on that table, if you like, is that we have now the promise of a new forthcoming cross-government mental health strategy. And I sincerely hope that everyone in this room and beyond have an opportunity to shape and to voice their expertise, if you like, and skills and knowledge to input and make that the very best that it can be. So that brings me to talk about neighbourhood mental health, which is clearly my passion and my day job. The genesis of this, you will all know and will have seen, has come from a lot of the policy that's gone before. But it's also come from a real upsurge, if you like, and rightful demand for a case for change. The need for this shift has become, as people would tell us, incredibly urgent. We know that demand is rising and people are facing long waits. People have repeated assessments and fragmented care. Too many people fall through gaps between services, and they and their families are often left, as we were, to navigate a complex system at precisely the moment when they have least capacity to do so. I think we'd all agree we cannot simply keep doing more of the same. We need to move from a system that we know is organised around thresholds and referrals to one organised around relationships and continuity. We think that neighbourhood mental health centres offer us a way to turn this ambition into a practical model. I would say, and I'm sure people are wondering, well, is this just another building or a service layer? Well, no, it's not. They organise care around people in neighbourhoods rather than organisational boundaries and referral pathways. I know there's a risk and there's a temptation that may happen, that they're seen as an add-on or something else that's come along, another new team, another thing to add to the fragmentation. But we are trying very hard, and it is with sincere intent from the people involved in them, people who actually work at the front line, that doesn't happen. This picture is an illustration of the 10 co-produced key principles that are the centre, if you like, or the foundation stone of the model. But I'm sure as you've looked at them, they'll be familiar to all of you, and probably things that you all have hoped and wanted to see changed and have tried to change yourselves.
Deborah, just to let you know, we have about 2 minutes left.
That's fine. You'll see I won't go through them all, but there are some that are central to today's conversation, like open access, trusted relationships, continuity, citizenship and belonging. Neighbourhood mental health centres are a team, a partnership of experienced clinicians, peer workers, social and primary care, community faith and voluntary sector colleagues. And we think that gives us the best chance and the best mix of materialising this new way of working. So, just in case you're wondering who they are, I'm just going to go through them very briefly. Here is the Tower Hamlets team. Here is the team from Whitehaven. Here is Birmingham. Here is York. Here is Lewisham, and lastly, Sheffield. And we hope, and you mentioned the investment earlier, but we hope within 4 years, this will be the picture. So we'll go from the 6 yellow spots, which are giving the pilots, to the red spots, which should be a much better and more comprehensive coverage. So, with the synergies, I think that everything that I can see in terms of the direction of travel, you know, really, for me, it is a shared direction. National policy is moving care into neighbourhoods. It's harnessing all the talents of neighbourhoods, all the strengths of neighbourhoods. It's harnessing all the people, I'm sure, who are in the room there with you today, colleagues from voluntary sector, peer workers, health professionals, social care colleagues. I think we do are sharing a philosophy, being more human, which to me is a moral and political calling. I think there is a synergy in this relational approach between policy and practice, trusted, consistent human relationships at the heart of care. I think there's a synergy in a place and an operating model. I think neighbourhood mental health centres give us that place and operating model to make these things possible. And I think, like I said, there's a shared ambition. I think there's something really special coming together, a generational window of opportunity.
Deborah, thank you so much. We're now out of time, but thank you for a brilliant presentation, which I'm sure will have resonated with so many people, both here and watching online. Thank you. Now's the portion where you get to join in. Woohoo! And I'm going to welcome back to the stage a familiar face, Professor Lynn Gabriel, who I'm going to introduce properly now, the President of the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, a passionate advocate for relational care for decades now, who's travelled down from York to be with us today. And we are also, Russell Razak, we're also inviting back up onto the stage to take any questions that you might have. We're also hoping to get Steve Pilling. We have Steve Pilling, I'm told, on the screen as well. So you have 3 experts who you can direct your questions to. So does anybody have a question that they would like to ask?
Let's go to online.
Okay, we have questions that are coming in from online, apparently, so we're just waiting to collate some of those. Lynn, there's a metaphor that you use, I'm told, that's about a bus, and we all need to get on the bus of mental health care. Do you want to expand a bit on that for us?
Yeah, and funnily enough, some of the neighbourhood mental health centres are looking at one of them already has a bus that goes out into the community, literally.
Oh, so it's a literal bus?
There's a literal bus.
Okay.
Yeah. So Deborah and the wider mental health centre team work hard, both with that metaphor and with the delivery of people getting on board together. And I think what we're talking about today on this launch of the findings from ODDESSI, it's really important. And I think Deborah there was signalling some of the ways in which people can ride together and make a difference together. And I'm excited by the kind of evidence that's being produced. And I have a question for Steve, I think it is. He said he used the wrong measure, or he may have chosen a different measure. I'd be really interested if he's willing to share it, and if not, I'll have an off-table conversation as a fellow researcher. Which measure, reflecting on it now, would you use if you wanted to replicate? I'm just curious about that. And if it's not relevant to now, I can keep it for later.
It's a perfectly good and difficult question to answer.
Yes.
You know, with any, I'll try and be brief here, with any randomized trial or equivalent, you need what's called a primary outcome. You need to put your money on one measure for reasons I won't trouble you with, but that's the way things go with randomized controlled trials. And as I said, I went for one which I think in the context of a population that largely had a psychotic illnesses, which was previous research I've done, I think it was the right measure. But for populations, the population in the ODDESSI trial, and indeed for populations served by neighbourhood centres, it's not. So I think what would be good would be some general measure of health and well-being. I think it could be a composite. That, I mean, such measures exist, but there's a work and social adjustment scale that's used in the NHS Talking Therapies program. I don't think it's probably right for this area, but I would have thought something that picked up on well-being and went beyond that in a composite way into areas, for example, like employment. I'm very fond of quizzes, and so I'm just going to say something now. Last thing I'll say in response to your question, which is who said the following, and the story is going to be that somebody gets the right answer to this, and Deborah's going to slip them 20 quid. But the question is, who said nothing anchors the individual to reality, such as the performance of work? And one of the measures that we might have thought about, do people get back into engaging in meaningful employment or other meaningful activities? That might not be a bad one, because actually it keeps you well as getting over the immediate crisis. But I'll leave... So I think a composite measure would have been better. It's not an easy one to choose, but I'd have put some effort into doing that.
Does anybody know who said
Answers in the chat.
Okay. I think it sounds a bit Thatchery. I don't actually know. Russell, do you agree with what Professor Pilling has just said? If you were going to pick what you think is, I guess, the most impressive outcome of the study that would make people go, wow, we really need to do this, what part would you pick?
Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, Steve and I spent a long time in his office thinking about the measure, and and it's very nice of you, Steve, to claim responsibility for picking the measure. But I also pushed quite a lot for this kind of measure, to be honest with you. Not the exact one, but this kind of measure, measuring relapse. But really, the big question is, what are the consequences, the implications, the lived experience of when people become unwell, and that. A measure around that is really what we're looking for. And I actually think that we did do those really important measures. We just labelled them as secondary instead of primary. It's a very academic question. What's primary, what's secondary? But looking at, I really like the co-produced recovery measure, because it's about what matters to people in their lives and how more able they are to get on. And it really, sort of links with the other measures we found in terms of less use of crisis services, less use of inpatient services. And so when people are saying that I feel more able to make decisions, I feel more confident in my life, better relationships, all of that is telling you that they're probably less likely to have to lean on crisis and inpatient services as a result. So these things match. So I do think that we measure some good things, and they are really fundamental and important to people's lives, but more along that in terms of what's important to people's lives, as Tommy was saying, as Steve just said, focusing on that more is probably more important when you're looking at a whole model of care, because we did something really, really unusual. We measured the whole model of care rather than just one intervention or treatment. And so thinking more holistically was probably important from the beginning.
Yeah. I'm kind of asking from a selfish point of view, really, insofar as a communicator, as somebody who works in media, if I was trying to convey this to a lay person, maybe somebody who didn't have any first-hand experience of mental health services, what would make them sit up and go, wow, we really need to start doing this? Because I feel like everybody in this room gets it already, but not everybody out in the world does.
Yeah. Yeah, well, what we were saying before in terms of the reduction in in having to go into hospital, and it is, you won't find many people who talk about wanting to go back to hospital once they've been in, and you will find many people who talk about, though they had a trauma before they and maybe a whole lifetime of trauma before they came into mental health services, often going in hospital has re-traumatized them. So being able to reduce that, I think, is a very good thing. Sometimes in extreme circumstances people need it, but I really do think the fact that the impact on that was so significant is really, probably the headline here. It has been literally the headline, and that makes a lot of sense. And it's a sort of win-win, because it makes sense for people's own experience. It's easy to understand, and it's also what the system really values, because we are overspilling on beds all the time. I mean, there's literally hundreds of millions of pounds being spent on people being shipped off to a different part of the country, to a private sector bed potentially, but somewhere far away from their own families. And being able to reduce or even remove that would be huge. And that's what our results suggest is very possible.
I Thank you. We have a question. Oh, did you want to add something?
No, I was just going to, there's somebody, you've got your hand up.
Oh, we have a question in the room, and then we'll go to the question that's come in online.
Mike, okay. Yeah, thinking about, I spoke to Jaakko Sekkola years ago and said, who's the most important member of the team? And he said, employment workers and occupational therapists were key to getting people back to work. And I'm thinking about these new centres, and are they going to encompass a whole range of things that help people reconnect with their lives, from housing issues, budgeting issues, but employment issues. So it's not just around mental health. It's actually, because the one thing I think we've struggled in our training is to connect with community groups in the way that I think we really need to support people's re-entering or staying connected with a life that they've chosen. So.
Thank you. That's a really good question. Who would like
Do you want me to quickly answer that?
Please, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, 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 and yes, already. In the 6 pilot sites, that kind of work is happening. And it was already happening in York, where I was involved in the pilot, still involved in the pilot. And if you want to have a look at one in action and look at the possibilities of pulling all of this together in that one site, there are 6 pilot sites that you could visit that Deborah showed on the map there. So don't hesitate to reach out and have a look at that. It truly is a multidisciplinary, interconnected way of working. And so that there's that, alongside the psychological therapies that I think if people notice, Steve alluded to in some of his reporting, and alongside a really important something else like OD. So I think it would be really good to have people go out into those centres to have a look. And Russell, I know you're coming to York, or we're inviting you to York. So it's great to have a look and see in reality just how it could fit. And John, you're from UKCP. Lisa and Ben from BACP are very interested in how this can help trainees who go out into community services, charitable services in the VCSE, and straight into working with people with serious mental illness. So how can things like OD and the centres support next generation practitioners from multiple disciplines? But yeah, so that was a long answer.
It was a great answer.
Sorry, I was going to say, could I just come in, because I'm spinning in my own grave, because I think I heard somebody whisper in the background that it might have been Margaret Thatcher that said nothing anchors. Actually, it was Sigmund Freud.
Very similar people, I think.
Exactly. But more importantly, I think when you're looking at the neighbourhood centres, and I've no doubt this has been considered, you start to get big data sets. And big data sets can be really quite informative. So just 2 things to just be aware of. One, we already know that if you've been treated in the NHS talking therapies, even if you've just been treated, not necessarily got better, you're more likely to be in employment at the end of that. And there are 2 RCTs, one from Norway, one from Spain, that confirm that. And the other thing that's now been established is something called Open Safely. It's a large NHS collection of NHS data sets run by Sebastian Bacon and Ben Gouldaker at Oxford. And that's pulling together data from all kinds of sources. So I think when we come to look at the neighbourhood centres, we should be doing some individual evaluations, trying to understand what's good and particular about certain services. But we can, with a couple of, a few years under our belt, start to look at very big data sets and then start to answer those questions about employment, who gets into employment, and crucially, not just who gets into employment, but who stays in employment. And picking up on what Russell says, and who doesn't get admitted to hospital and who stays out of hospital. So I think it's a longer, it's a bit of a march through the institutions, but I think we're much better now, a much better position now than we were 5-10 years ago to start using big data sets to really inform policy and understand what is working and what maybe needs to change because it's not quite working properly.
We have a question here at the front now.
Yeah, just going back to that, the time to relapse measure and sort of thinking around that. I was curious because it seems that, you know, open dialogue holds a different view of distress and seeing distress in context. And I'm curious whether this came out in the study, that what was actually happening with people continuing the conversation, let's say, let's not call it time to relapse, coming back to have a further conversation when things felt difficult, was people's view of their own distress in context changing through these conversations, as opposed to being in a system that tells them that they have a diagnosis and that there is something wrong and where that takes you. So I'm kind of curious whether that was one of the doors that was being opened up and whether that came through in conversations and in the study.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because if you compare the data around time to relapse and then, you know, co-produced recovery measure, you see a real difference between the two. So while, you know, a sort of clinical ascertainment of symptoms and relapse doesn't show that change in terms of, you know, frequency of relapse, people are reporting that what they define as important to their recovery is changing, right? So there's that difference, and therefore you could hypothesize that as a result of that, because what was important to them was changing, even if they were technically becoming unwell, they were not ending up in hospital or crisis, anything like they used to. So what's changing are the things that are really fundamental to the fabric of their lives, which might not be, you know, mirrored in the symptoms, but it's actually how they're able to govern themselves. So there was a real difference in terms of what people were reporting versus what was coming out. But then you see the proof of it in terms of what, you know, how much people end up in hospital, how much people end up in crisis. It's really interesting, that difference.
I'm sorry, just to add to that, I also think that using picking upon the term dialogue, I think that probably, and we don't know if this is true or not, but if I were to start again, I think that the enabling of discussions between members of the community teams, between individuals with a mental health problem and their families, actually was a really important part of what worked in open dialogue. And it was a single discussion. I mean, I still do a little bit of clinical work myself. And I know that my heart sinks if I think I've got to talk to the community team, I've got to talk to the crisis team, I've got to check what's happened in the emergency department. And I just know that if you've got 4 voices in there, all with slightly different priorities, all understandably anxious, you end up going with the quotes, least risky solution, but it might not be the solution that's in the best interest of the individual, and which the individual themselves don't feel they've got an equal share in arriving at that decision. It's sort of, quotes for want of a better way, taken out of their hands. And I think Russell can comment on the detail of this better than I can, but I do think that a containment of the discussion of the distress, of trying to understand the problems and the wider social context of them, I think the open dialogue teams just did a better job of that than the multiple teams that you might be engaging with at a point of crisis. And there's still some use of crisis teams by open dialogue, but it was much reduced. And I think probably, again, Russell will have a view on it, I think that issue about admission to hospital was probably just better handled. So I think it is about having a dialogue that helps people understand their position, staff understand that, and you come to a better, I think a better solution reflected, as Russell says, in a better self-rating of recovery than we got from our rather inappropriate measure.
Thank you. The question that we've had come in from online is, well, there's 2 actually, but they're both, can you say more about this thing? So the first thing that people would like to hear more about is the family involvement in network meetings. So I guess it doesn't have to be family, but it is 2 people that you choose from your life, isn't it?
So I mentioned this a little bit of this earlier. In our, here in the UK, it's a lot less usual for families to be involved, so you have to make more of a case for that to happen. In my clinical work, and I know other colleagues who've been in the trial found this, that sometimes it took quite a few goes before you started to bring the family in. So often it would be just that person coming on their own because that's all they're used to. They've often been in services before. And it takes a few sessions before you start talking to them to the point where they're thinking, you know what, perhaps I should bring my sister in, somebody else in, even though we've been advocating it. So the numbers are a bit smaller because it's taken us time. Whereas if you're in Western Lapland, for example, you will arrive with your whole clan because you know that's what's going to happen in your treatment. So there's a difference there. Secondly, we also measured every contact, and we determined through measuring every contact what was the, how many additional family members were there. But actually, not every contact is a network meeting. So lots of those contacts are supposed to be one-to-one. So I'll have a meeting, with a family, and someone will say to me, I just want to talk to you alone about this, because there's something private and personal, relating to other family members they don't want to share. And that's fine, we can do that outside the network meeting. Or it might be something about medication review they want to do outside. But because we counted all of those in the study, it looks like the network meetings didn't have so many people in. But the truth is, if we just looked at network meetings, and we discussed this right at the end when we were collecting, we could have actually found probably different numbers, but we didn't. We weren't able to do that, didn't make that distinction. These are one of the things that you learn through doing the study. So partly it's that, but partly it's also there's a different culture in the time it takes to engage people.
Thank you. And then
I'm a bit more of a miserable numbers man than Russell.
Okay.
I think the numbers aren't great, but I think that's fine. As Russell said, it then gives you a clear target going forward about how we need to be adjusting our programs to kind of engage families more. And it may be a neighborhood model might facilitate that rather better than the current models we have. But we need to work a bit harder on it, I think.
Okay, and the second thing that people wanted to know more about was the difference in use of medication, and they said specifically as it affects people with experience of psychosis.
Yeah, so all right, specifically psychosis. So what's really interesting is that I convened meetings with the other psychiatrists in the trial several times during the trial. So Gareth is here, and a few of us would meet up, and I did ask about this every time. What we're doing, what's happening with prescribing? What do you think is happening? And everybody sort of thought that was happening, that there was a reduction in about a quarter or a third. There's a significant chunk less prescribing going on. And I can only speak from my own experience. That was happening because actually most of the time medication was prescribed is because it was asked for, because the network was saying, look, the patient was saying that this is something they want. And therefore it's going to be used because it's their idea. It wasn't me gaslighting them that it was important. It was coming from their own dialogue and their own experience. And so we were able to collaborate more on that. But it was coming because it was asked for, including in psychosis. I mean, at the end of the day, if there is something really distressing or risky to the point that they really do need that kind of support or help with sleep or being able to take the edge off symptoms, then it will come from them, right? And that's how you do it. Whereas even in psychosis, if it's something that they feel like, what, I can live with this, I can get on with this, I'd like to have more of these dialogues, then as long as we're not worried about any risk right now, we can allow that to continue because we're going to meet again in a few days and we'll have that discussion some more. So because we're talking about these things in a lot of intense detail, because we're allowing their view to predominate, then in the end, you end up using medication less. And a lot of the time, medication that was prescribed was there because it was prescribed before they came to us, right? A lot of the time it was that. So new initiation probably reduced a lot. We haven't looked into that. We could actually, just an idea, Steve. We could look into the data set. So many different things we're looking into from our data set. But certainly the total amount prescribed was less. And I think it's something to do with that, something to do with it coming from the network and us being open to that, so long as we continue the dialogues around it.
That is all the time that we have for questions, I'm afraid. But thank you so much to both of you and to Professor Pilling for joining us online as well. We have a treat for you to end the day. It's a video that, like the trial, has been many years in the making. Yes, thank you both. Has been many years in the making, and it's going to be screened Monday night at 7. But we wanted to share with you the trailer before you go. So here is the trailer for this film.
I've been waiting 8 years for the results of a groundbreaking study into a new system of mental health care called Open Dialogue. The ODDESSI trial has been researching crisis and mental health care in the NHS, comparing ODDESSI peer-supported Open Dialogue with treatment as usual. And I'm on my way to find out exactly what those results are.
I can honestly say it's one of the best things that I've had. Again, a little bit emotional.
My name is Emma Good, and I'm the author of My Beautiful Psychosis, a memoir which charts my experience of mental health care over the course of 7 episodes of psychosis.
They're drawing up an injection for the rapid trank.
I've not had the benefit of receiving open dialogue, but having filmed the training course for 3 years, it features in the last chapter of my book, where I wonder, what would my life have looked like if I'd had open dialogue? Open dialogue was developed in Finland. A large-scale independent study began in the UK back in 2017, one that involved 500 patients and was randomised to ensure the results were beyond reasonable doubt. The ODDESSI trial. It was funded by the National Institute of Health Research and led by Professor Steve Pilling from University College London.
The most impressive result that's emerged from the ODDESSI trial is that open dialogue, compared to standard treatment, helped people stay out of hospital, and actually by managing to keep people more in care in the community, we've also saved costs, which at present time in the NHS is pretty important.
And also the chances of ending up having crisis services and needing crisis support from services is also significantly less. So people's quality of life is significantly improved in open dialogue compared to treatment as usual. People's experience of recovery is significantly improved by their own definitions. So things like I can get back to work, I feel more independent, my relationships are better, I feel more autonomous and capable in my life. All of those things are improved in open dialogue compared to treatment as usual, as well as the general quality of life. They also have a significantly improved experience of their service. So the way they rate the service they have in mental health care is also significantly improved in open dialogue compared to treatment as usual.
It's brought us together, and it brought us together for the same cause, to get me better. You just say everything that's in there to these people, you know, you'll probably end up giving yourself your own answers in the end. And that's what worked for me.
And it couldn't have happened had open dialogue not been there.
It's
Because she would have buried that.
Yeah.
Sally would have buried that.
You're seeing someone different on every appointment, and you've not really got that sort of relationship
no.
and trust, really. I mean, a lot of it is about trust. You know, you're unburdening a lot of personal matter.
And without open dialogue today, I truly don't think Sally would be where she is now. Without a doubt.
Yeah.
I've been hospitalised 6 times now, and these results show that if I'd had open dialogue, I would have probably got the support I needed to manage these crises better. In fact, the odds of me not having a hospital admission are 3 times higher if I'd had open dialogue. And that would have made a huge difference to my life. So now we know how incredibly effective it can be. Hopefully, more people can have it. Not just the hundreds in the trial, but thousands across the country, and indeed millions across the world, who's suffering from mental health problems and need this kind of help right now.
I was going to sit there. I had a whole different view of the room. Filmmaker Emma Good is joining us now. So you've spent years making this film.
Yeah, well, actually, it started off as a completely different film. I came back from living in Argentina, from living in Buenos Aires in 2022, specifically to make film, which it didn't pan out in the end. So I convinced Russell to turn that into this film so that we can promote the trial results.
And was there anything that surprised you when you were making it?
That's a good question. Well, I'd already been filming the training for 3 years, so it wasn't new. I don't know. I can't actually think. I think something which was more frustrating than surprising was trying to get people to get involved, to be in the film is quite a challenge, because obviously people are sharing really deep personal stuff, and they're focusing on getting the care that they need, and then to kind of go in with a camera and start disrupting that process. So I was probably surprised that anybody agreed to be in it at all, actually.
Yeah. And you must have had to have taken such care of them to be able to do that.
Yeah, I built up a relationship over time, and somebody, one person invited me into an open dialogue meeting with them, just online, just through Zoom. That was a real privilege.
And you speak as well about your own experiences and how your outcomes might have been different if you'd had access to open dialogue earlier. Did you come away feeling, I want to say angry, were you angry at all?
At what point?
I guess
I've been angry.
I guess I was sort of reflecting and thinking how different things might have been for you.
No, I think by that time it was 1996, my first episode. So I was just really happy to get on board somebody championing something else on the table. I think I'd got through, writing the book helped me get through a lot of resentments that I had, because I had to process them in order to write them, to make them palatable. So then by the time open dialogue was on the table, I was like, yes, let's get on board with that.
And what do you want when hopefully lots more people see this film? What do you want them to take away with them?
A sense of possibility, that they can get it into their own trusts. I'm hoping it's a tool. Already I'm based in Manchester, so already we're going to have a screening in September. So I want people to go, oh great, we're going to organise something and get the CEO from the trust in, and wondering how they can organise their event. Then they can bring this film in to help tell the story a bit and bring stories alive.
It's so important, isn't it? Because I think that it is the storytelling, and if you can't sit in front of somebody who's been through it, then a film is the next best thing. It's so powerful in helping people to understand. So thank you so much for the work that you've done, and thank you for being here today. Emma Reed, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of the event this morning. I just want to have a round of applause, first of all, everybody who's either played a role in or taken part in the ODDESSI trial over the past 10 years. Can we give them a round of applause? What an incredible thing to be part of. Thank you for the opportunity to host this. It really does feel like a landmark moment in mental health care in Britain. Thank you to everybody who was here today and everybody who has joined us online. One final request from us: if you do want to keep the momentum going, and if you want to bring open dialogue into your area, then you can go to the website. You will see there will be QR codes dotted around the room, and that will give you the information that you need to be able to do that. That also applies if you just want to keep in touch and stay up to date. Thank you so much. Russell, do you want to say something else?
I'll say thank you to you. So two things. Just to on the issue of the website, one thing to mention is that, as Steve said, the next thing we really need to do is to think about how we're going to implement at scale. And we're already looking at funding and looking at how we can organise that, working with trusts and health boards across the country to try to implement open dialogue at scale. That means because there's actually savings that can be made from it, you can actually find the money to do that. So, with upfront funding, we can start to train whole trusts or whole health boards on a large scale. We can start to implement it through getting coaching involved and helping to change the care pathway, getting some experts helping to operationalise the model differently, and also building capacity into the teams. So we're looking to do that right now. We've got an implementation program we hope to start in January of 2027, and then subsequent waves that will come from that. Now, if you're a decision maker, if you're a senior leader in an organisation, in a health board or a trust, and you're interested in being part of that program, please do get in touch with us. Go to opendialoguenow.com, and you can contact us directly from there and get involved in this program, which we hope will last for many years to come. What we need to do next is very clear, and we hope now that we can go ahead with all of your help and do that and start to spread things further. Thank you. And thank you especially to Natasha for today, for taking the time to come and host us so well. One thing we talk about in Open Dialogue with Teachers is about tolerating uncertainty, and you did a lot of that today. So you're halfway there. But thanks so much for Natasha, and a round of applause for Natasha.
Thank you so much. Please go and live your lives.